Good morning, everybody. Good morning. There we go. It's always lovely just to... Oh, sorry, I was shouting then. It's always lovely to hear the buzz and the energy in the room, especially on a Monday. It's early. Welcome to BT Tower. Called that for the moment. It's going to change, as I'm sure many of you know, turning into a hotel at some point soon. A quick domestic thing. No fire alarms are planned. If the fire alarm does sound, clearly out the door, turn left, out the way you came and on the street, but not actually in the street, please. Ladies and gents out there to the right and basically in that direction, you'll find that well. It's a real pleasure to start the week off with Charlie and friends at Restate. I was, like many people, slightly cross and marginally annoyed when another organisation claimed the name, but you can have your own thoughts on that. I think it's a really great name, to be fair, and what it means for me is talk is important, but doing is really important. We've got to deliver stuff, really, and what we've got in the room and the work that you and your team do, Charlie, is massively important to keep the wheels turning and moving in the right direction. It's been a real pleasure and an honour to support, genuinely I mean this, to support your work over the years, even before you joined, back in Andrew and whatever. But particularly you, Charlie, yeah, absolutely. And it's a real, and genuinely I mean it, and I'm concerned that, well, I'm concerned that actually where we are right now in the politics and the economics, as many friends who I know in the audience would say the same as well, it feels right now, the time is right now to make some substantive changes. We all know there's issues around legacy. Stefan, you and I have talked about this previously. There are lots of issues, but we need to grapple them one by one by one. And there's nothing more worthy, I think, than actually reimagining, rethinking, and restating how Whitehall should then support the outer realms of governing the country and making public services better, and ultimately the lives of citizens of the UK much better. So there's no harm in restating stuff in a slightly more nuanced way. A week is a long time in politics. All politics is local, that's the phrase, I think. I can't remember who said it. So without any further ado, brilliant to have you here. Thank you ever so much, Charlie. Please come up.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much to Simon for hosting us again. Obviously, as Simon said, this is going to be turned into what I can only assume will be a very luxurious hotel. But we were told last year that was going to be the last year, and we're back here. So I'm kind of confident we might be back here for at least one more, I hope. But thank you to Simon and to BT for hosting us, and thank you also to Salesforce for making this possible. I always say at the start, whenever introducing a big event of ours, we are a charity, and therefore the support that we get from our partners, we've got lots of our partners in the room today, is what allows us to do the work we do on a daily basis. I'm not going to repeat what I normally do, which is to kind of reinforce why or explain why we have a Reimagining Whitehall programme, because I think by this point it should be very obvious that if you don't rewire the very nucleus, the heart of government, then we have little hope of improving our public services, of ensuring that the state actually does deliver for citizens, that it is value for money, that it's effective, it's productive, and it's achieving the outcomes that we want to see. So I thought I'd be slightly indulgent, if you don't mind, in my sort of 2 to 3 minutes that I have, because I have a fabulous team. It's a real privilege to lead such curious, innovative and brilliant thinkers in Restate. So I thought I'd just mention a few wins that we had recently, because we are very proud of the impact that Restate, I can tell you we were slightly more than marginally annoyed when Reform took our name, that Restate has had. So I'll do this very briefly, but as I say, it's a bit of an indulgence, but I want to reflect just the impact that our 10-person team has on an almost what feels like now weekly basis with the government announcing things. So just a few examples of across our 3 work streams, which I'm sure you all know are Whitehall, local state and health. So in 2024, we called on government to make devolution the default. So we actually published a paper called Devolution by Default. And later that year, the government published their strategy, which is devolution by default. And we said, you need to fill in the map. And government said, you know what, we're going to fill in the map. Actually, as far back as 2017, but particularly then in a major paper in 2024, we said, you know what, NHS England doesn't work. You need to scrap it. And you need to then devolve, and you need to actually make place-based health a real thing. And I'm sure you all will remember the moment when we got flooded with congratulations messages actually from people saying, you know, you did it, when they announced that NHS England was going to be abolished. Of course, we want to see them do the next stage of the reforms, but it was a big deal for us. In 2024 as well, in fact, not that far off this time last year, slightly earlier than this, we said, you've got a massive issue with poor performers in Whitehall. And actually, I don't think there's been a paper we've published where we've had quite the overwhelming response from current civil servants themselves getting in touch and saying, thank goodness somebody's talking about this. You know, this is the sort of elephant in the room, and people saying we really do have a problem. And then, first of all, unfortunately, just slightly before the election was called, John Glenn, then the Cabinet Minister, stood on this stage and said, we are going to do those reforms. But we're delighted that now Pat McFadden has said he too is going to implement many of the reforms that we put forward in making the grade. And to give one more example, we last year called for, in fact, maybe it was even this year, we called for a massive review and streamlining of quangos. And just weeks later, the Prime Minister stood up. And I've got to say, many of the sentences in his speech looked very, very familiar to how we had, almost to the word, phrased the reasoning behind the need to bring more of public bodies back into greater control of the politicians who are delivering. So we feel at Restate that actually the work we're doing on our tiny team is having a tremendous impact, and we're really, really proud of what we are doing, but we really couldn't do it without many of you sitting in the room today who support us in various ways, whether that's from partnering with us to make our events and our research possible, whether it's simply just supporting us financially because you believe in the need to really radically rethink how the state works and what it does for the country, or whether it's because you're working in a department or the centre of government or local government or the NHS, and you give us your thoughts and your ideas and your insights about what could be transformative if only we could get that message through to the centre of government and the decision makers to actually put that policy into practice. I'm going to end by reflecting on one comment that Simon made, which is, as ever, 100% spot on. I was fortunate to be invited to a podcast last week on whether this government is delivering. And I said in it, the gap between policy and delivery is where populism grows and lives. And that's why this is important, because actually to have a flourishing, competitive, strong nation with political leadership and governance that is actually in the interest of the people and public services that work for the people, we need the great ideas. We need your thoughts and your insights. But then we need to be able to translate that into implementable blueprints. And that's what we do at Restate. We take the big ideas and we translate them into the how. How do you actually deliver that change? And then we work with people in local government and central government public services to try and think through how you then deliver it on the ground so that actually people are genuinely seeing the value of the state and the impact that it has. So thank you for joining us. We've got a brilliant 2 panels, and then we're finishing off with a keynote from Minister Gould. And then, I'm not going to say it's the highlight because we've got some fabulous speakers already sitting in here who are going to be on our panels and will be outstanding. But you are also then going to get lunch in the revolving BT Tower at the top. And so that is a big, big highlight. So do stick around for that. Come and talk to the team. Come and talk to me in the breaks. Thank you so much. And I will hand over to Simon, I think it is, for the first panel.
Welcome, everyone. Is my mic hot, or is it about right? Where are we? Yeah, got some thumbs up at the back. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Mission government, mission-led government, the transformative principle that we were promised, well, about a year ago, but I think for many years before, and perhaps in many different incarnations before that, the transformation in the way that Whitehall and all of the interrelated systems of governance in this country should be transformed. In this panel, we're going to be talking about, well, it's a kind of a progress report, I think, and we have a fantastic set of panelists joining us here today to engage in that progress report. Is the transformation playing out? Is mission government shifting the way that Whitehall operates? What more needs to change in order to seize upon the opportunities of a very different approach to delivery? Thank you so much.
Well, once an events manager.
That's fantastic, interesting. And,
It's all about delivery.
It is that you've already delivered very effectively there. So running down from my left here, we've got Susan Ackland-Hood, who's of course the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Education. We're joined also by Dr. Michelle Clement, who's a lecturer, King's College London, Strand Group, but also the researcher in residence at number 10 Downing Street and the author of multiple books, including The Art of Delivery. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Richard Clark is, of course, the Director General, Public Safety Group in the Home Office. Crucially for our discussion, the Senior Responsible Officer, the SRO, for the Safer Streets mission, one of our big binding missions of government today. Hope that's going well for you, Richard. We'll be hearing from you soon as well. And Ed Stainton, Managing Director, Public Sector at BT, to give us an outside perspective on how all of this feels different from the outside looking in, a perspective that I might reflect on a little bit too. And of course, many thanks to BT for hosting us here today and supporting and making this entire thing possible as well. Susan, I'm going to turn to you first. You've got a leadership position in one of the most important departments in government. Have you seen this transformation playing out? Is it making your everyday feel different, or is there more to be done for mission government?
Both of those things, definitely. So yes, it is making the everyday feel different, and yes, there is more to be done. Hello everyone, it's very nice to see you. I'm Permanent Secretary in the Department for Education. I'm also one of the lead Perm Secs on the policy profession across Whitehall, so I think quite a lot about how we do policy and particularly actually how we translate it into delivery. The Department for Education is the lead department for the Opportunity Mission, which is about breaking the link between background and success. And it's a really good example of why mission-led government is important. It's a fundamentally difficult thing to do unless you have departments working together. It really has felt like it's touched something that ministers all across Whitehall really care about and want to work better together on. And we've invested a lot of time and a lot of energy this year in trying to set ourselves up really well around that mission goal and to be quite specific and hard-nosed about it. So I think that there's quite a lot of risks to mission-based delivery, as well as some absolutely enormous opportunities. And one of them is that in an effort to identify really cross-cutting missions that everyone can get behind, you end up sort of defining motherhood and apple pie, and then everyone spends a lot of time saying that they really like apple pie and are also quite fond of their mother. And so what we've really tried to do is take a goal that genuinely does inspire people from the heart and really input some head into it and say, okay, but what does that actually mean in practice? What does the goal look like that best represents that? How do we make sure we're thinking really hard about some of those things like, well, if you're really serious about breaking the link between background and success, you have to cant to focus more on the very earliest years of children's lives, because so much of the gap that opens up in opportunities is there before the child is 5. And that's one of those things government has said before at various times, but the politics pulls you back to think about 5 to 16 school-age children all the time. It's a really noticeable feature. I mean, I've worked in the Department for Education on and off for really quite a long time. And so really taking seriously that thought that best start in life in the under 5s is your priority, and you are actually going to shift resources to that. We've done that over the course of the year already, and we can see that we've set out more kind of work on that through the spending review period. We had joint meetings between departments in the run-up to the spending review to align our priorities and line up our bidding, which is quite unusual. The spending review tends to push you towards a much more bilateral set of engagements, and I think the mission's really helped us to do that. But I think we spent quite a lot of our first year thinking about how we've lined ourselves up to make this work, and not enough of our time communicating, engaging, and pulling more people in. We've got external links. We've got some work we're doing on connections to particular places around the missions, but I think we need to go further and faster on the broader external engagement as we go into the kind of second year of mission-led delivery. And then the two things I was going to end on were I've talked a bit about the mission we lead. We are also really working hard to be good followers as a department on all of the other missions. So we are incredibly central to the growth mission. There is no growth without skills. And we also have an enormous part to play in each of the other missions, in safer streets, in clean energy, and in the NHS Fit for the Future. Again, skills central to all of those, but actually a set of things we can do during children's early lives as well. And I think the essence of great mission government is to think as much about how you're going to be a great follower in the mission you're not leading as how you're going to be a great leader of the mission you are leading. And we've got fewer natural incentives to do that and have to work harder at it. And then the final thing is culture eats structure for breakfast, always has and always will. So we can finesse and play with the structures a lot, and it still won't substitute for people taking it seriously, wanting to do it and deciding to believe in it and make it happen. And I think there's something about just everybody leaning in and doing that as hard as they possibly can.
Something really interesting in the point you make about needing to be a good follower of the mission that's held elsewhere in the system, just as much as being a good leader of the mission that sits directly with you. This might be unfair. You tell me how wrong I am about this. But missions as a principle for organising outcomes, for achieving delivery, we're pushing right up to the end of the envelope of what a departmental structure can help us achieve in government, right? Isn't part of what we're doing here is we're exploring a critique of the department structure?
Yes, I mean, to some extent, I think that's right. But I think you also have to kind of ask yourself the question: if not departments, then what? I mean, let's look at other big corporates like BT. You have to structure yourself somehow. I mean, if you get to the point where everybody thinks it's their job to do everything, then literally nothing happens. So somewhere along the way, you're going to have some structures. They're not going to be perfect. You'll have risk at the boundaries wherever you draw them. And so designing mechanisms that force you to think across boundaries is going to be important. And in addition, back to the culture eat structure for breakfast, if people are too deep embedded in their structures as a tribe, then you won't get the outcomes you seek. And I think we've got lots of learning we can do with other very large organisations about how you make that work in the best possible way. But I'm deeply sceptical about the idea that you just dissolve all departmental boundaries and it would be better. I think a whole load of things would be significantly worse because people would be very unclear about what their job was. It
would be very hard, wouldn't it? But I suppose there's an argument for... I don't think it would just
be hard. I think it would be stupid. Like, if it was hard, then but good, we should do it. Like, do you know what I mean?
I do, yes. Well, I mean, rest assured, I will never cross the line from hard into stupid.
I don't mean to be funny about it, but there's a real difference, right? We should do hard things, and indeed often we should do things because they're hard, but particularly in government.
So your response to the argument that in order to achieve these cross-cutting missions, actually the resourcing, the staffing, the organisational principle has to be focused on the outcome, that the mission itself might have to supersede the department a lot of the time.
Yes.
Is that happening?
Yes, I think it is, and I think you can see. So the other thing I'd say is, again, I've been in government a reasonably long time, and I've worked in quite a lot of different bits of it. And one of my observations, and this is so there will be at least some people who've like heard me have this rant over a pint. One of the things I've said repeatedly over time is, actually, government has quite good structures for managing disagreement. So if Department A wants to do black and Department B wants to do white, there are structures in government that are reasonably good at trying to decide whether you do black or white or whether you think the right answer is some sort of like slightly compromisey shade of grey. The Cabinet Office is there to do that ultimately. You can take things to the Prime Minister and make a decision. Civil servants are quite good at escalating up through a set of kind of meetings at which you decide to do those things. It's actually weirdly harder to do things where there's in principle agreement but a difference of priority. So there are a whole set of things we work on where the conversation with other departments doesn't go, I think this is the answer, and the other department goes, I think that's the answer, and then we all have a big fight. It's much more common to say, well, we think this is really important, and the other departments say, oh, yes, we agree with you, that will be a really lovely thing to do, but for us, it's actually only about number 200 on our list of priorities, so we'll get to it like in about 5 years' time. And those ones are much harder to resolve. So a lot of the mechanisms of government are designed around like dispute resolution, not priority sifting or joint priority setting. And I think one of the things that the mission architecture does really rather well is say, this is a named collective priority for the whole of government, and therefore even if it is quite a long way down your list, you still need to pull it up in service of the wider whole. And I think that's valuable. And again, you've always been able to do that for a few things through kind of I'm sorry, you now represent number 10 in the room for me. Just say, but you've always been able to do a few of those through the PM or someone close to him, number 10, saying, I care about this thing today. But structurally, it's been harder to set those collective priorities. So I think it addresses quite a long-standing challenge of government.
I suppose the shades of grey of coming across lots of different priorities means that you end up doing a little bit of everything, which is sort of not a mission-based approach.
Yeah, and I think, government is a big machine and it's got a very large number of jobs it needs to do. So, again, you want government to do lots of things. Do you know what I mean? You don't have to go very far into the exercise of asking citizens what they'd like government to stop doing to find that's quite a difficult set of questions for everybody, not just for government. But knowing what your trade-offs are and being able to make those trade-offs at the level of government collectively as well as at the level of the individual department helps you make sure that you pursue the things you really care about full-heartedly across the whole of government, rather than finding that you've got something that is one person's priority but has got drag on it because it's not as high up the list of another.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Sorry, I was supposed to limit myself to one follow-up question per person, but if I keep doing this, I'm going to ruin everyone's day.
Shall I shut up?
No, it's very much me who should be doing that. But let me hand straight over to you, Michelle. Among other things, you've got a historical perspective on these kinds of efforts. Have we been here before? We've tried to do something akin to missions in government to change things?
The last government that tried to do huge renewal of the state and public service reform was, Blair's government, which is what my book is about. So I'm kind of here to offer a historical lens, but, you guys are at the coalface, so, sort of take what's true, ignore what's not. But yeah, so the book is based on my PhD and sort of 600,000 words in Michael Barber's diary. So I sort of put my head into the pensieve and came out and then interviewed the Secretaries of State and the civil servants and special advisors to get a sense of, cross-referencing. Was this true? Was this your experience, et cetera, et cetera? So, it gives an insight into how things worked then, but I know that the context is different now. I thought I'd give you a bit of the story itself because, some of you will remember it. Some of you, like my students might have been born after that government got into office. And so, take you back sort of 20 years. So May 1997, 18 years out of office for Labour. They come into power. They've got a huge majority, so that inflates public expectations of how quickly they can deliver. Blair, first time in government, never been a minister before, last time in government, as we know, unless he does a David Cameron. He becomes frustrated very quickly about the pace of public service reform. But actually what was happening there is he was frustrated with actually their modest manifesto commitments and, they're focused much more on standards, which are important, but he suddenly realises through crises that actually there needs to be system reform as well. I mean, governments have to do these things at the same time. One of them, the everyday person notices in a parliament, like their waiting lists improving or their school class sizes, reducing. They don't notice so much NHS England closing because, there's a time lag with these things. And as you were saying, Susan, the different reforms that you can do to, say, change the departmental structures, there's a time lag and there's a cost because you've got to deliver in the parliament. You've got this burning platform. So Blair learned through crisis, the fuel protests and the flu crisis and so forth, that how the system actually operated in reality. Before that, he wasn't as involved. The 1998 Comprehensive Spending Review was the turning point after sticking to Conservative spending plans for the first couple of years. They started to put money in, which at the time, they said was sort of transformational. The transformation really came in 2002, I think. And as part of that, public service agreements were introduced, which is where we get the sort of target culture probably originating, because initially there were 600 targets when it was first came out, because they didn't want to look, they wanted to look prudent. It was about the imagery as well of a Labour government who hadn't been in power since the 1970s, not looking profligate. But there was no underpinning framework for delivering those public service agreements. It was quite a stick rather than a carrot. Fast forward to 2001, second election victory. Blair wants a quantum leap. He sees that second election victory as a mandate for reform and instruction to deliver. By this point, they have got a clear, ambitious plan. They have had successive spending reviews, getting the money into the system, including a 10-year NHS plan. And they are thinking about how they can reorganise the machinery of government to, in the first instance, better support the Prime Minister to deliver, so a strategy unit, a delivery unit, a changed policy unit, and then the different departments are also pursuing their own reforms. And the delivery unit is my focus. And that was created to sort of monitor the Prime Minister's priorities and also, if they could, hasten them, but in a much more kind of supportive, qualitative way. What that meant was ruthless prioritisation of a small set of prime ministerial priorities, which, as we've seen in recent years, doesn't always get done. You know, people say what they're going to do and then, you know, crisis averts them, or they don't have to deliver, they can win through populism. It's worth keeping in mind, as I mentioned, that the delivery unit was part of a wider whole. There was, you know, more institutional reforms happening, intellectual changes within each department, within the different public service reform areas. So it didn't operate in a vacuum. But the challenge of reforming the structures and the policies at the same time to ensure short-term delivery was a real challenge. And Alan Milburn, who I interviewed for the book, said to me, what you're doing is you're flying the machine and you're building it at the same time. And I wonder if it feels a bit like that in government and will in the coming years. In terms of how the delivery unit worked in practice, it was staffed by about 40 civil servants and consultants who shadowed each of the delivery departments they focused on. They established the sort of science of delivery, new routines. Some of these will be familiar: delivery plans, delivery reports with league tables, stock take meetings with the Prime Minister and the Chair, priority reviews. And of course, they encounter challenges. They encounter challenges even being set up as new units do in government. They encounter challenges from foreign policy and crises. Again, you know, I think although there's been the spending reviews obviously only come now and a mission delivery unit was created, you know, a while ago, you've got to get these things underway and embedded so that when the crises hit, there is a system in place that can start, you know, can keep you on track. Delivery never sleeps was the term at the time. For the purpose of this talk, I'll just say what made it work, and you can ask me questions if anything else is of interest. David Blunkett told me that it became a transmission belt for departments to communicate issues back to the centre. You know, this is often seen as a sort of top-down mechanism, but actually, when it works effectively, it can also help unblock problems for departments. It addressed gaps in capacity to deliver with the health department, the Home Office in particular. There was, you know, various new units set up, new second permanent secretaries created, because they're getting into the kind of grit of what was actually happening on the ground. It worked closely with the Treasury, which at that time was a bit of a miracle because the Chancellor and the Prime Minister didn't always get on. And so although it was created as a tool for the Prime Minister, it started to assess the deliverability of new policy programmes because they understood how things were working in departments, so that they could, you know, best assess whether something was going to work going forwards. The approach of the delivery unit at Michael was to be plain speaking, firm, transparent, outcome focused, not to claim credit for progress until they left government, and then also give the team conflict resolution training, which again was needed at that time. I don't know how much is needed now. Relationships underpinned all of this, the art, as I'd say. That was about leveraging relationships within departments at all the different levels, but also as they changed. There were, you know, of course, there are ministerial changes, permanent secretary changes, etc. So you've got to manage that, and you've somehow got to get the new Secretary of State to do what their predecessor was going to do, as well as them allowing them the space to have their own sort of priorities. I'll leave you with two quotes. Sally Morgan, who was Director of Government Relations, said to me that the delivery unit drove a different view of what the government was there to do, that it wasn't just about policy, it was about getting something done. And Blair, to show you how he evolved as a leader during this time, in 1999 complained of scars on my back. By 2002, he was saying to a group of civil servants, "You probably got used to the idea that your career depends on me." It doesn't, they're permanent. I'm just coming to terms with the idea that my career depends on you. So it helps transform public services, change the role and culture of the civil service, and set a new standard for what it meant to be an ambitious Prime Minister.
Thank you, that's fascinating. Is there a potential lesson here? Certainly, maybe you're going to debunk this. There's a reputation attached to those blades. By the way, describing the relationship between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister as, in the way you did, I think maybe the understatement of the century. There's a reputation attached to those Blair years that the importance of a subject was directly correlated with the amount of attention that Number 10 and the people immediately surrounding the Prime Minister and the Chancellor paid to it. Is there a little warning from history for us here for our mission government?
Well, look, my view on that government is actually, you know, Blair was criticised for being too powerful Prime Minister, but he had a really bloody powerful Chancellor who was pursuing his own parallel agenda in social justice and fairness and sort of growing the Treasury empire. And then you had the Prime Minister pursuing public service reform. So, I mean, I think you wouldn't want that level of creative tension, but actually, you know, it meant they got a lot done.
So it actually fueled the fire a little bit.
I think so. It did galvanise things. You know, the people that got squashed were the Alan Milburns.
Okay. Well, it's good that the current government doesn't have any tensions inside the cabinet at all, isn't it? Let me come to you next, if I may, Richard. You are in so many ways in the hot seat when it comes to conversations about missions. How are you finding it? Is it going well? Are you getting everything you need? Can we help you in some way? How do things look?
Oh, well, thanks for that third question. I mean, the first thing I should say is it feels utterly surreal to be listening to a historian talk about a period when I started my career in the Treasury in 2001. I mean, absolutely fascinating, but also makes me feel old. Look, I mean, I think the overwhelming feeling that I and others who are leading missions feel at the moment is one of excitement. I mean, it's a huge privilege to be leading one of these big missions. So there are kind of, 5 or 6 of us, I guess, leading these big programs of work. We stay very closely in touch, you might imagine, and kind of share experience, things like that, and work very closely with the mission delivery unit, which I suppose is the sort of the kind of current manifestation of everything that the team in Number 10 learned from the Michael Barber period, and Michael is still very much around and influencing. So that group of us who work on this, I think, are conscious that we are delivering things that are important to the government, important to the Prime Minister, but they're also important to the country. And I think, I said at an event recently that this is the first policy area I've worked on, I would say, where people really kind of bang on my door and say they'd love to work on it, partly because these are really big, complex problems. I think missions as a concept work best when we're talking about really big, complex problems that can't be solved exclusively from Whitehall, that aren't about technocratic solutions, certainly not technocratic solutions on their own. In some cases, they might be about things where we don't actually know how to do them yet, and we want to kind of build a model for how we do it together, and where the solution to solving those problems is about a proper joint, and you'll hear more about this, I'm sure, from Minister Gould in the keynote later on today, the vision of us working much more closely, even more closely than we do now, with local partners on the ground. And there's no way of saying that, I think, that doesn't sound slightly buzzwordy, but I mean, whether you like the term co-production or not, this has got, I think, to be about local charities, local authorities, the police, in my case, locally, and government centrally working together to solve challenges like knife crime, and over a 10-year period as well. So having the opportunity to be able to think, what could we be doing now that will pay off? And the best example of that, I think, for me at the moment, to pick up on something that Susan said just now, is work on kind of early intervention and prevention, where things that we're doing now so I've got a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old boys, things that we're doing now in schools with young people will pay off in 8, 9, 10 years' time. So having that kind of long-term vision, I think, feels really important. In terms of what you can do, I mean, I think events like this are absolutely fantastic, an opportunity to be able to bring people together who are interested in what we can do to tackle these missions together. And I promise this isn't a sort of nod to the building we're in at the moment. I do think over the next few years that technology and AI is going to play a really, really important role in this, whether that's in the kind of doing some of the sort of underpinning stuff much better. The classic example, I guess, in my part of the world, and again, an area that Susan knows well from previous jobs, will be things like, the amount of time it takes to fill in police forms, the redaction process in the criminal justice system, things like that. If we can use AI to do that sort of work so that people can be spending their time doing the really impactful interventions that will actually have the long-term impact, then I think there's a great opportunity for us there. But I also think working jointly with the private sector and thinking about private sector companies, really innovative technology companies, working as part of that sort of group that I described earlier on to make a real impact in this area, I think will be absolutely critical. So in answer to your question, it feels really exciting. It definitely feels challenging, but that's why it's so brilliant to be able to work on big problems like this.
So how often in your role do you find you're shoving your whole weight against a closed door with an important colleague, a team, when you say, look, we have to lift our heads up. We have to think about this in the medium, at least the medium, probably the longer term. We can't afford to fight fires anymore. We need to dedicate the resource and attention to getting this right. I'm responsible for it. How often is that a hard conversation in your department?
So I wouldn't. Well, so the first thing to say is that my role is completely cross-cutting. So I have sort of two hats that I wear, if you like. The first is that I am as the SRO for the Safer Streets mission. My job is to coordinate all of government's efforts against that mission, and that's a really important point. So I feel like I've almost got a sort of like a pseudo cabinet office type job in some ways from within the Home Office, and that my job is to coordinate it across the board, and then I'm directly responsive, if you like, for those bits that we have levers in within the Home Office. And some of those levers are incredibly important, but actually lots of the most significant levers, to continue this analogy, are in other government departments. They're in Department for Education, they're in Department of Health and Social Care, actually things like Department of Work and Pensions and the role that it can play in relation to ensuring that women who are in violent relationships, it's easier for them to flee those relationships and not more difficult as a result of the way in which we design the benefit system, for example. So my job is to coordinate that across government, and I can genuinely say that in the year or so that I've been doing this job, doors open in front of me, not the other way around. I think Susan's point about the challenge of how to manage differential prioritisation, I mean, that's absolutely inherent, I think, in anything that government does. But I do genuinely think that the combination of a very clear steer from number 10 in the Cabinet about the importance of this, really clear steers down from permanent secretaries that they want to be great leaders and great followers in their areas, and frankly the fact that people are hugely motivated to make a difference on this means that I have from day one felt a really positive camaraderie with my colleagues in other government departments who want to make an impact on this.
Thank you. That's really reassuring, actually. Thank you.
Did you want? Yeah, go. I have one thing on this, which is I think embedding the SROs for the missions in the department that's leading them has been really important, and it's right. I mean, Tony, who leads on the Opportunity Mission, would say the same thing. It really feels like having a job that is cross-government, but you happen to be sitting and doing it from the department, and I think that is a good build on the kind of Blair era model, which did feel a bit more like the Cabinet Office came and kind of like steered your battleships on your big table for a bit and then wandered off, and often in an incredibly helpful and constructive way, I would say. But that trying to get a bigger shared ownership of the sense of jointness, priority and ability to lead a clear cross-cutting priority, and that not always having to mean that pulls it straight into the centre, I think is a really important contributor to being able to do this across a much wider range of things. Yeah. So if you're trying to do it all from the centre, you are massively limiting the total number of issues on which you can do that seriously at once.
That's a really important point. Let me bring in Ed at this point. I think there's a couple of really interesting connecting points to your expertise, Ed. First of all, the idea of partnership and co-production. Some of these missions need to create a different feeling when we engage with, when we partner with, when we observe the working of government. You're a fantastically well-placed person to reflect on whether that's starting to feed through the system in that way. And secondly, the tools that are being used, the techniques that are being employed, the approaches, are they shifting as well? Do you want to give us your sense of how missions are transforming government?
Well, I've been working with the government for the past 8 years in various guises in roles at BT. So I don't have the inside track to share like my esteemed panellists do on what it feels like being part of this mission, but I can bring three things to the debate. The first is I'm going to have a strong bias towards technology and the role it plays in these important missions. The other is the external feeling and view from the outside into government. And lastly, BT itself is a very large organisation that's going through a mission-based transformation. So starting with the external view, I'm just going to first of all touch on the word mission. It's very purposeful language. It's not kind of ethereal kind of language around strategy further down the road. It sounds quite surgical in its intent, and the way the missions are outlined for someone looking outside into government is very clear as a partner to government where the priority lies. So I think that sets out a good stall, and I'm just going to touch on what I've seen so far as probably one of the clearest manifestations of a change in behaviour, and to the point Richard made earlier and to your question around partnerships. So I attended an event a couple of weeks ago with Secretary of State for Justice and the Minister for Prison Reform. And there were 25, 30 technology partners in the room. And the ask of us was, please help. We need your help, and actually quite demanding on us to say, please come forward with ideas, because we have to transform. And recidivism and is a key part of your responsibility, I'm sure, as well, Richard, in the way we have need to have safer streets. But there aren't many occasions I can think of where we're actually being really challenged. And there's follow-ups to that meeting with invitations for partners to put forward ideas. It can be quite intimidating looking at government when you have an idea, and how do you actually take that forward? Because there isn't always the appetite to take on risk. There isn't necessarily the appetite to engage with partners or suppliers or whatever category you want to put us in from the private sector. And I think that's a blocker to progress. So the more examples of this we can see focused around those mission outcomes, I think the best you will get in a joint collaboration. Because frankly, the civil service, government cannot achieve these missions all on their own. You need organisations like BT, Salesforce, but all other technology partners and non-technology partners out there making the right investment choices in their business, so then it flows through into better outcomes. And we've been doing that in BT. There's been a strong signal for technology and its role in the NHS, and we have really doubled down on that. We've invested in AI technology to help with diagnosis and to speed the whole kind of primary care loop up. And we're doing that because there's strong signals from government. So, I guess to my panelists and anybody else in the room who's interested is keep sending us those signals, because then you've got the whole of UK industry behind you. Couple of other observations, and you asked, I think the second question was around some of the tools or the ways that you can encourage better collaboration. So before we get too excited about the potential of AI and the exciting technology that sits out there, government does have a lot of technology debt. There's a lot of legacy out there, and if we are going to use technology as a force multiplier to really deliver some of the outcomes that we're hoping for in these 5 missions, then we have to grasp the nettle and make sure that funding is not just available for AI, but also to address some of the tech debt that sits out there. So I think that's an important point. The second, shining the light a bit more onto partnerships, the emphasis of working with SMEs. Even though I work for a big corporate, the emphasis of working with SMEs is I think, really commendable. We need homegrown technology, we need homegrown investment, because we have become far too reliant on overseas technology and industry generally. So I think that's really encouraging. How can large business and SMEs work together, I think, is an area for more exploration. Where some of the direction, I think, into some of the spending within government departments is, that there are set targets around you must spend more with SMEs. Well, we would also argue that big business can also really help. And actually, the way we're restating ourselves is I've actually just been through a process to devolve our public sector business. Okay, so we still have centralised teams that look after the big government departments, but we're devolving our go-to-market approach across the UK around unitary mayoral authorities, around clusters of NHS groups, because we understand that as a large organisation, we need to be much more in tune with what's happening locally within communities. I think that's a really important point. I'll just make a couple more remarks. Social value. That kind of external, I guess, outside in perspective. working within the private sector, but very closely aligned to government. Sometimes we feel like we're an extension of government, but social value delivers a sense of pride and purpose in our work that perhaps didn't exist before. So I think social value in the way it's evolving is really commendable, and it allows us to attach our technology investments, our relationship with government to societal outcomes, and I'm really pleased to see that social value has restated itself more in line with the 5 missions. Yeah. So I think that's really good. And then just my last point is one of resiliency. You know, in technology, if you're going to have technology as a force multiplier and an underpinner of all this transformation that's going to take place, you know, resiliency in your supply chain, the cybersecurity risk, and everything else that sits around that, it needs to be considered when big technology choices we're making, which is why BT is really pleased to be involved with NVIDIA, announced at Tech Week by the Prime Minister last week, to be creating a sovereign AI hub along with some other big British brands. I think that's really, really fantastic. And I think is more of an indication that the government is prepared to look at resiliency rather than just, you know, consume tech irrespective of its origin or where it comes from. So they're the key points I wanted to make.
That's really, really helpful. I want to open it up to the room in just a moment, so if you have questions, start getting them ready. But a question down the line for anyone on the panel who wants to pick it up based on all the observations so far. We've talked about partnership, we've talked about the idea that government can't do it alone, we've talked about co-production. Is that happening in practice? And if there are boundaries and barriers that are preventing that kind of cross-cutting working, going beyond central government to local government, going beyond all government to other kinds of partners, what are those remaining barriers? Susan, do you have a first answer on that?
Yes, so I think it is happening. I think the most fundamental barrier is the one-to-many problem. So basically, we spend a lot of time working with civil society partners, with local government, with business, and there are a whole set of things we can do through a set of kind of relationships and structures. What tends to happen is you have lots of individual, for example, local government chief execs who say, this is all very well, I would really like a personal relationship with the department in which we help to shape your central strategy because we, insert name of local authority here, have something very particular to offer you. And they're right. I mean, they do have something very particular to offer, but everybody is looking for a central strategic relationship that is kind of particular and unique in which they get to play a key role, and it's really difficult to offer that on a one-to-many basis in the way that you get. So again, we're doing it, and we're finding a few ways through that, and it's not, that's not an easy problem to solve because there is value in doing some things where you dive a bit deeper into one place in order to understand it and try and shape your place-related work. So we're looking, for example, sorry, I'm pausing because there's a thing I can't remember whether we've announced yet.
Go for it. That's all right.
Don't go for it. I won't go for it. We are exploring whether or not we could be linking, if we have announced this, you're all going to look at me like I'm mad, but we're exploring whether we could link more closely particular missions with some particular places in order to do some test bed and exploratory work that would allow us to make some of those relationships that allow you to give more status to particular people in the central strategic work as well as in the kind of diaspora. And then I also think there's a role technology can play in helping us think about different ways of designing and co-creating that allow you to lever more people's contributions in different ways. So we've been exploring, again, not just the work that, for example, the NHS has done through the development of the 10-year plan, where they've kind of opened up to a much wider public conversation. But we've got tools in Policy Lab, which actually sits in DFE, but it serves the whole of government, which look at how you do much better work on citizen and wider engagement with your policy development process. So we've used video ethnography as part of our work on the Opportunity Mission, for example, to try and bring people's voices much more clearly into the policy-making process in a way that I think is actually potentially more powerful than your traditional, government consultation document, which tends to get responded to by people who like responding to government consultation documents. who are very valuable and wonderful people, many of whom may well be in the room.
Many of whom are in the room, and we love you all.
But they don't necessarily represent...
The usual suspects.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we call you bread and butter, and we're so glad that you're here today. Michelle, do you have a reflection on this?
Yeah, look, very short. You've got to be very clear about what the incentives in the system are and what can be done by the end of the Parliament, because that, will quickly become the focus. And we're still early on now, but, an election they'll be starting to focus on that. The lesson from the first term of that government that I cover is that it was a continuous campaign to win a second election, to embed the changes. And so being very clear about where you're at and what the incentives really are is important.
I think there's something quite interesting for me about evidence. So I think we've got, in some places, I think we've got very compelling evidence nationally and internationally about what works. Shout out for the Youth Endowment Fund, for example, who do brilliant work on pointing out those things that there's very good, longitudinal evidence that shows that this thing is likely to have an impact. There are other areas, and again, I think this is one where the sort of rapid pace of technological change makes this more challenging, but is also an opportunity. I think there are other areas where it is just much less clear what will work to make a difference in some of what we're working on, and there are kind of two obvious responses for that. One of them is to kind of do more work collectively to understand what works, and the second is to try things and see if they work. But I think that would, if we didn't do that right, I think that would be a limiter on our ability to make an impact.
Do you feel that you have cover's probably the wrong word, the cover you need to try things, to see if they work, to try again?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yes, definitely do. Yeah.
Excellent. And the partnership question that you sort of initiated.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of touched on this during my opening remarks. And I'll probably just come back round to a comment Susan made. Not to re-quote you directly, but something along the lines of, you can't have a strategic relationship with everybody who wants to come and solve your problems. And I understand that, because it's a big wide world out there, and there are lots of solutions to lots of problems. But how can you create a level playing field? And I think that really is important. But an ecosystem, maybe a consistent methodology across different government departments, so partners understand what that methodology is and how they engage with it, so that ideas can be presented, but then move quickly into experimentation, and be prepared to succeed and fail, but at least we're trying, at least we're experimenting. Where at the moment, it feels like that's quite hard yards, and there's a lot of red tape that gets in the way. And I think it's a real missed opportunity, and I'm not quite sure where in government this would sit to kind of drive that consistency, if it's a cabinet office-led initiative or whatever, but I think something needs to be put in place to really allow innovation to flourish.
And don't get me wrong, I wasn't saying you can't do it, it's just that there's something about when you do set up a system that everyone can join in with, you then still get people saying, but I want to partner with you on a different, do you know what I mean? And somehow you have to manage that one-to-many challenge, whatever you're doing. But I don't think the answer to that is not to talk to anybody. It's to try and make sure you've got routes for everybody, and that you keep asking yourself the question about what you're missing if you're, as it were, focusing. Because I think we spend a lot of our time thinking about a level playing field, and sometimes that makes us make the playing field really complicated for people.
Yes, that's right. I think we are. I think there are two ways in which governments can engage with the private sector when thinking about solving big problems, and I think there's a good one and a bad one. I think the bad one is to say we have gone off in government. We've thought about this for 5 years, and we would specifically like this thing, please. Please, will you build us this thing? It needs to look like this and be this colour and have these things sticking out the side of it. And the alternative way of doing it is to say, we are worried about how we are going to achieve this outcome. How can you help us with that? Which might mean you conclude that you don't need a red box with things poking outside of it. You need a fundamentally different way of doing something, which in some of the best examples I've seen turns out not to be anything to do with technology at all. And technology companies help you to think, well, actually, this is a kind of process thing, isn't it? So I think being open, and I think this is where missions really help, being open, really open about the problem you are trying to solve, and inviting a conversation about how to do it, or the challenge you are trying to meet, as opposed to saying, we've got a 2-week window to ask for a design on this specific thing.
That's really useful. Right, well, I'm going to stop monopolising this conversation and open the floor to questions. Yes, please, go for it. Cool. Mic is incoming. Thank you, Alice.
Hi there, I'm Paul Morrison. I'm the Chief Executive of the Planning Inspectorate, and like Richard, feeling very old to hear the PMDU described as a historical artefact. Susan and Richard, you're both leaders who've done both policy and operations, and I guess one of the perennial things in all of these is the struggle to link policy and then actual delivery and operation, and a tendency to do the thing that Richard was just talking around the wet towel around the head, thinking up the solution, and that includes the input of ops people, and I now count myself as an ops person, having done both policy and ops. And how are the missions given the opportunity for us to really start bridging that divide? Because obviously the vast majority of senior leaders in the civil servants are in policy roles. All of the kind of the mission leads are in policy. I'm not saying that they are policy people because they've all got a broad spectrum like yourselves. But how can we bridge all of those gaps, not just the operational people at the front line in local government, but also within government? And how's it going in the missions? And are we seeing a shift, do you think, in that?
Great question. Let's get one more in. Yes, lady on the third row there, please. Just passing it down.
Thanks. Jess from Civil Service World. It's also about the missions. I just wonder how much the message about the missions is getting through, because a lot of senior, really quite senior, including DGs, people that we speak to, it just hasn't really touched their professional lives at all, and it feels more like business as usual. It doesn't seem to have brought the kind of revolution in government working that perhaps pre-election people might have been expecting. I mean, does every senior official need to eat, sleep and breathe missions? Maybe they don't. Maybe the right people who are in the right places. But just in terms of, if you could comment on the comms message to other senior civil servants, that would be great. Thanks.
Two fantastically spiky questions. Let's start with those. So Paul, I think, brought up one of the perennial questions about the way that Whitehall functions internally, which is the dislocation that sometimes can be observed between operational roles and people who define themselves or are defined as policy professionals. Are missions helping to close that gap? Susan?
Yes, I think they are. I mean, one of the things I spend quite a lot of my time as head of the policy profession going around and saying is, like, policy is literally pointless if there's no delivery. It's just a piece of paper. Like, what's the point? And it's one of the reasons, I mean, we have three pillars in the policy profession, strategy, democracy and delivery. And people sometimes are a bit surprised that delivery is a pillar of the policy profession, but it absolutely has to be. I do think missions are helping. And again, it's about that. I mean, you, as you said, the language of missions is a practical doing language, not a thinking really hard language, and the architecture of thinking about the aim and the target, the big hairy goal that you kind of draw people together around, I think is really important. And I mean, certainly in the Opportunity Mission, we're spending a lot of time thinking about the delivery of those kind of goals. And on some of them, there was already enough kind of in place that we've gone really quite quickly into the delivery space. I also think there's a thing we don't always talk about, which is we mean lots of different things when we talk about delivery or operational roles in government. So we have bits of government where you literally are doing the delivery. I mean, I used to run HMCTS, and I had people who were court clerks and court ushers doing the business of running the court every day. In DFE, we have some people who describe themselves as delivery, and actually what they're doing is interacting with local authorities about school improvement. And that is a really important role, but it's really different. The front line, the most frontline delivery role, if you're thinking about education, is in an interaction between a teacher and a child in a classroom. And that's a really long way away from anyone who calls themselves a civil servant. And so understanding what delivery really means in your context, where that fundamental interaction is and what the different actors and influences on that seems to me to be profoundly important. But I actually think it comes back a lot to what Richard was saying about evidence and what works. You never start policy in a green field, but you're always flying the plane and fixing it at the same time, because, you know, we're all like living life and doing stuff, aren't we? And so any respectable bit of policy making has to start with what's happening now. What do we know about what's working? What do we know about what, you know, who's doing this best? Where does it look like There's something we could be taking something from. And that comes from really good insight and interaction with the people who are actually doing the delivery on the ground. And if you're not doing that, you're not doing policy properly. And I mean, I kind of think that's been true before, during, and after missions, but I do think the goal orientation of missions helps people keep coming back to that. And for me, it's all about interaction and feedback loops. Like, have you got the feedback loop from the really fundamental delivery interaction back into what you're doing? And is it functioning properly? Do people really feel like their voice is heard in that?
Can I have two reflections to that? So the first is that I think the missions are acting as a kind of galvanising moment for operational colleagues who have for some time. Actually, galvanising is probably not quite the right word, actually, because I think it's more, maybe it's a kind of crystallisation moment or an opportunity to be able to do something. Yeah, exactly, yes, I think that's a much better way of putting it, actually. Who in some cases have been thinking about this for a long time. So I think if I think about violence against women and girls and knife crime, in both cases I've had border force officers say to me, oh, I've been interested in this sort of thing for a while, and I've got some stuff, and this gives us an opportunity to kind of bring those things together, as it were. And then I think the other thing is, for us, we have deliberately designed a way of delivering this mission that is in really active partnership with the police. So there are police officers engaged in the design of the mission and engaged in the delivery structure of the mission in a way that hopefully gets us as close as or as far away as possible from the kind of the stereotypical model that you might otherwise feel of a government department kind of handing something over to. I think that the thing that we're really trying to avoid with this is the sort of, we've designed this thing, now please go away and do it, and someone says, but this thing doesn't fit into it doesn't fit in, like it doesn't work.
Thank you. Any others in the panel want to weigh in on this operation policy divide? Is there some equivalent to this in large private sector?
Yes, so that was my third point I was going to bring to the debate, which is BT itself is going through a big transformation, and it's all about culture, frankly, and trying to rally the organisation and galvanise around a common goal, a common mission, but to get the organisation working as one team. The question around policy and delivery, for me that's a culture piece around are you all pulling together as one team, because that you will only ever succeed at transformation if you have that sort of mentality and approach, and also being brutally honest is another key takeaway. I think that we have suffered with a little bit in BT. We haven't been honest enough about where we actually are on that transformation journey. And one of my colleagues coined the expression watermelon reporting, which is green on the outside and red on the inside. And it's easy to fall into that trap, to tell you that everything's fine and yes, this transformation is going well. But actually, you're probably tracking it against what you know today, not against the original business case that may have been created 2 years ago. So I guess that's some observations I would have from kind of outside-in perspective.
I'd just add from being the historian on the panel, I don't know if anyone else is, but delivery is still a relatively new role for the civil service. When back in that era, the late 90s, early 2000s, it wasn't seen as a role of the civil service. It was the original cabinet secretary from that period said, if I'd been asked to be responsible for delivery on the front ground, on the front line, I would have said that's not what we can do from here in Whitehall. That shifted hugely in that period, and I think we're seeing again a resurgence, and hopefully that change will trickle down. To a horrible phrase, but will come from many organically from grassroots up, but also from the different missions.
Useful. And of course we had Jess's tricky question. Richard, can I take that one to you quickly? I think it's fair to say that when you have conversations with very senior people in the civil service, it is true that the amount of penetration of the mission mentality varies a little bit. Just put forward the possibility that, well, maybe you don't want it to be all pervasive. But what's been your experience on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, my experience is, so this definitely doesn't feel like business as usual. My experience, I think, is that this has felt like a powerful galvanising moment from the election onwards. I think that the Prime Minister himself has been very open with the civil service about the importance of making sure we're going after these missions. I get kind of very, as I said earlier on, I get very strong support from DGs and colleagues across government who play a role in it, and the Home Office is also a very active follower into other missions. So I detect no sense, I think, of this being seen as business as usual. I think it is a really important galvanising impact. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll say one more sentence on that, which is, I think, I mean, there is something about recognising there is work beyond the missions, and that's important actually, both for the other work and for the missions, because if you don't say that, then everybody just pours everything into the missions and they kind of lose shape and meaning. I mean, the only other thing I'd say, I can't believe I'm saying this as a civil service world journalist, fun times. I mean, in any organisation at any time, whenever you do anything that's new or try and shape yourself in a new way, it is always going to be possible to find people who are a little bit more at the, well, it's not that different, is it, end of the spectrum, and people who are at the more kind of like, this is brilliant, let's make the most of it and do something with it, end of the spectrum. I am a kind of totally unashamed, self-confessed, joyful Pollyanna, and I think you get more done that way. But, you know, are you going to be able to find people who are a bit more in the kind of... I think there's also something about being careful not to oversell, right? So sometimes people speak about the missions as though nobody in a Whitehall department's ever spoken to anyone in another Whitehall department ever before, and that's obviously ridiculous. So there's something about how you ask the question, like, has this transformed your life? Are you speaking to people in ways you've never spoken to them before? You probably get the answer no. Is it making things better? Is it different? You probably get the answer yes. But I think there's also something about the change moments are opportunities, and they're opportunities to kind of lean in and find ways of doing things that are different. And I think the vast majority of the people I know and work with in the civil service are inveterate leaner inners who try and make the world better every day. That's what they're doing there. So that's the posture I encounter most often from people in the civil service.
That's good to hear. Now, we're going to give an early round of applause now to Susan, who I believe has to leave right now.
You're applauding me for leaving early, which seems a bit
well,
outrageous, really. But I'm very sorry to be leaving. I've just got a meeting I have to go to.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. It's been fantastic. Everyone, a round of applause for Susan. Brilliant to have her here for any amount of time. Let's go back to the audience for further questions. Yes, at the back. Thank you.
Hi, Jen Manuel, Deputy Director in Human-Centred System Design at MHCLG. I've got a bit of a question about, so mission government is, you're talking about complex systems and you're talking about trying to change, reform, transform, whatever you want to call it, complex systems. Now, in complex systems, problem X isn't sort of very linearly solved by a solution. So how can we reconcile that with some of the more delivery unit style approaches of monitoring and measurements, where, and especially taking into account some of the things that have been said on co-production, actually, we don't want to risk sort of hitting some targets, metrics, measurements, but missing the point and the people in the system not having it feel any different. So I'm just wondering about that, how you reconcile, how do we measure this, how do we ensure it without falling into a trap of, here's a complex system and here's 10 targets we need to meet to change it.
That's a great question. Any others in the room? Oh, let's get Carla. Over at the front here, Alice, sorry. Oh, I guess Rosie could have done that. Sorry, Alice. Alice getting her steps in.
Thanks. Carla Groom, DWP, Head of Human-Centred Design Science, very similar name to a lady who spoke earlier. And possibly a related question. So I've been thinking about accountability systems. I talked about this at another reform event. Justification systems. How do we sort of scrutinise what we do, justify to the rest of the world? And there's important parts of that are Parliament, media, NAO, others, even think tanks, political scientists. If we're talking about doing more policy in the open, if we're talking about bringing in partners like BT, if we're talking about tackling things where we don't actually have a plan, we don't know what the plan would be, how do you make it so that you don't fall over at the first kind of, how do you justify this? We can't because the world is complex and uncertain and we're working this out. Any thoughts from there?
Oh, that's really lovely. And let's get a third one in. Make sure. Oh, and from this side, the gentleman at the back there, Rosie, could you pass the mic down? There we go. Yes.
Thank you. Conrad Thompson from PA Consulting. We've not talked much about money. Which is understandable, but I absolutely buy, culture does trump strategy, and the mobilization and engagement opportunity of missions is clear. However, if you've got money, you are holding some aces, and therefore, at risk of stretching the metaphor, obviously with the spending review, ink just drying on that, noticing we've got Defence and NHS aren't here, maybe they've already gone off and started spending their money. But how do you allocate money even better towards the missions?
Fantastic. Third question. Okay, so Conrad's asked us about resource money. How do we allocate it effectively? Yes, there's been a clear sort of winners and losers from the last sort of spending review. I think I might editorialise enough to say that. Carla asked us about policy making in the open. What does it mean to not fall down at the first few hurdles that occur in complex systems? Connecting, I think, really well to the first question there. Measurement is linear. Sometimes it feels like achieving outcomes, delivering can be linear. But the complex world doesn't always reward linear engagement with the problems that we face. 3 really interesting questions. I'll leave it open to the panel, which ones they want to engage with.
I'm happy to respond initially on the first question. I mean, the delivery unit, an effective delivery unit should be, mission delivery unit, as we now have, should be facilitating those conversations. I mean, it should be doing the opposite of, typical kind of Treasury levers of power of very much, here's the money, go and do it, and tell us, 4 or 5 years that you've done it. But a delivery unit should be much more, involved in the conversation on almost a day-to-day basis, help, understanding where the blocks are, understanding where the best practice is, bringing them together. It should actually be a sort of connecting instrument, and as I said earlier, to communicate issues back. So yeah, if it's working well, it should be helping, not hindering.
So it iterates rather than being straight.
Well, and it connects. It connects parts that would otherwise, a centre that would, be Prime Minister says, it should actually be much more on the ground. At that time it was run by, relatively young civil servants who were going out there and, genuinely doing quite earnest work in some ways of trying to understand what was really going on and trying to help. I mean, my father's a Quaker by background, so if it's working well, it should be helping.
I don't think. I mean, first thing I'd say is I think there are a sort of range of different kinds of things that we're trying to do. If you take all the missions as a whole, I think there are a range of different kinds of things that we're trying to do, and some of those lend themselves very well to a kind of classic: are you on track? Where did you think you'd be by this point? If you're off track, what's your mitigation? How are you going to do it differently? And I don't think there's anything wrong at all with building structures that incentivise that and drive against it. And then I think there are other things that it's much more difficult to apply that kind of methodology to. But in those circumstances, that's for me where it's really important to fall back on 2 things. The first is to very much build on the point you just made, to kind of turn that into a conversation. So, how do we think this will work? What would it take to achieve this? Where can we get the evidence? What can we be doing now that would pay off in 2 or 3 years' time? What can we be doing now to start thinking about the kinds of measures that would make a difference in that? And perhaps being a bit more creative about what those measures might be. So, measures of the satisfaction of a member of the public with the thing with the government system with which they're dealing, for example, rather than a kind of left to right, how do you deliver this thing? And then the second thing I think is that trial, testing, trialing, seeing whether things work. And I think in those circumstances, making sure that we've got the arrangements to support that in departments, I think is really important. At the moment, it feels like we do. And again, I'm absolutely sure that Georgia Gould will touch on that when she speaks later on, because I think that was so important in the work that she and others, I mean, there may well be people in the room from Camden who took that kind of approach. I think if we can do that on a national scale, I think it gets away from that, otherwise that sort of hitting the target but missing the point, as I think John Reid used to say.
So there were 3 questions in a row that I thought were interrelated, going right back to Jess, I think, from Civil Service World. Kind of comms, that bit around measuring. For me, that's all about belief. Do colleagues within the civil service really believe in these themes, these missions, and do they understand what their role is in delivering them? I think that comes down to leadership. And I can't answer this one. It's more a question I'll leave hanging out there is, is the civil service investing enough in its leadership and the training and development to support leaders to be able to take their people on that journey with them? And
yes, I think so. I mean, I and lots of colleagues have certainly really benefited from the kind of development programs at different points in our careers, and I think I've really noticed. I think that if I think about some of the sort of development opportunities I had earlier in my career, they were very focused on talking to other civil servants. You're now much more likely to be in some kind of program where you've got a chief constable, a local authority chief exec, somebody running a university in a program with you. So yeah, I think so.
One of the kind of hardest things as you go through a change, a transformation, is getting across to your audience, to your colleagues. It is different this time because there will have been so many attempts over so many years that have had varying levels of success or failure. But of course, every time you are leading a transformation, you want to get across it is different this time. And I think that's an important part for leadership within the civil service. But I'm going to come back to the question actually raised by, I think it was PA Consulting, around the money. And working on the outside of government, whenever there's an announcement, the first thing we're trying to work out is the money real money? Or is it money rehashed from another budget that's dressed up as something to look like real money? And that can take quite a while to kind of flow through the system to actually work out, is it real money? And then where is that money going to be deployed? How is it going to be put to best use to deliver outcomes? And that can take quite a while to kind of, again, come through into a requirement from the market. Where in between, we're still missing that kind of experiment phase, that taking bold risks, working with potential partners on a level playing field, but getting out there and ideating new concepts and ways to tackle problems. It seems like there's quite a big gap between that and then when money is made available, how that actually then hits the road and then gets spent. Eyes poring over the spending review from last week to just work out, what in there of that news is actually real money.
Yes. Do you have enough money, Richard?
Well, I think someone said that the ink is only just sort of drying on spending review, so we're working through at the moment what we do next on it. I mean, what I would say is I think Susan made this point earlier on, but I really agree that I think the build-up towards this spending review really saw the Treasury approach it very consciously in thinking about how you can bring departments together to think about mission challenges in the sort of least siloed way we can manage, I think.
That is literally all the time we have for this fascinating conversation. I got a lot out of it. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. It's unlikely because I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you all. We have some tea and coffee happening outside, but before you run off to that, and of course after that our next panel, please join me in thanking our brilliant panel.
All right, we're gonna kick off with the second session today. I think this microphone's working, or I'm just bellowing, but either way, you all seem to have picked up. My name is Joe Hill. I'm one of the policy directors at Restate, and thank you for coming back and leaving the tea and coffee and snacks where they are. I know they're very tempting. This second session of the day is titled Getting the Machine Learning, an AI-driven Whitehall. It's one we did in this very room about a year ago. But I like to keep doing these things because I think some policy areas are timeless and some are timely. And this one is exceptionally timely. We're talking about AI in government, and even over the last year, so much has changed. I won't catalogue what's gone on and why, because I suspect some of our speakers will over the course of it. But this is kind of one of the fastest moving and developing areas of public service reform that there is. We're joined by a really exceptional panel here today, and I'm just going to go from the end down. They're not quite sat in order of speakers, but we're lucky to be joined by Liam Wilkinson, Head of AI Incubation at the Incubator for AI and DCIT, Chloe Hoggard, Vice President of AI at Salesforce, Christoph Prinz, Director of Data and Identity at the Home Office, and Sapna Sanghvi, who's the Deputy Director of Data Science and AI at the Ministry of Justice. Thank you all very much for being here. You're all very welcome. In the spirit of that introduction, I have one question I want to ask everyone, maybe in slightly different permutations, which is, you know, a year ago, 2 years ago, we could have been having this discussion. AI in government isn't new anymore. It's maybe newer in some bits than others, but we've been on a transformation journey which for some areas has taken several years now. And I think it's tempting to act like we're always right at the start when we're not. So for the benefit of the audience, I want to start by asking everyone, kind of what have we learned? You know, what are the lessons we've learned from trying and experimenting and sometimes getting it right and sometimes getting it wrong? And Sapna, can I start with you?
I think there's a lot we've learned. I think a big thing for Ministry of Justice is, have we got the right quality data? What are our data foundations? What do we need in order to build AI tools where we need to build bespoke solutions? How are we going to really go from proof of concept to something that's sustainable over a long period of time? How are we going to monitor and evaluate that? So there's a lot of learning that we've had over the last few years. Also, how are people working? We've got people kind of nationally a lot more now. People do have Copilot, ChatGPT that they're using either in their home lives, bringing their own tools to home. How do we make that accessible for them? So I think we've been on quite a journey in terms of previously just doing a lot of experimenting, but actually now thinking about what is that end-to-end life cycle. Oh, is it not end-to-end? It's a life cycle, continuous improvement. And how do we do that in a sustainable way?
Just to briefly elaborate, the end-to-end life cycle of technology is a kind of well-trodden concept in government. But I was going to ask, does that look and feel differently when we're talking about data science and AI to how it might look in other areas?
I think there's a lot more to consider in terms of ethics. And Ministry of Justice, 2 weeks ago, we published our ethics framework on AI and data science in the criminal justice system, and we're looking at how we can kind of apply that to wider MOJ policies as well. But I think there's a lot more to think about in terms of, like I said, data quality, biases in any systems that we're using, sustainability. Is it accessible? Is it explainable? Potentially using more complex algorithms than people have used in the past, and therefore we need to be able to explain that it's not just a black box, but people understand how, if it's a assisted decision, how is that recommendation made? How can we be really transparent about that?
Fantastic, thank you. Christoph, you've been working on this in the Home Office for a bit now. In fact, long enough that I used to work with you on it 7 years ago. Feels like a long time. I guess the Home Office in many ways was one of the first movers on some of this kind of technology in government. You're a long way down that transformation now. What's the main takeaway for people who are maybe trying to be fast followers?
So, I think there are some new things, and like you say, we've been using machine learning in various bespoke tools for ages, and those obvious things are like image recognition, analysis, looking at passport photos, or assisting police officers to analyze data, and large volume analyses, etc. And we've been doing that for years, and including on things like triage and cases. And the irony for me around possibly the world's most complex technology is it's remarkably easy to understand generative AI, and people kind of get their heads around it and they go, oh, okay, I put some stuff in it and it gives me a plausible set of answers, and I've now got something that I can engage with. And it's been really galvanizing for the way in which people have participated in that conversation. We're now getting to a point whereby actually we're hitting a whole bunch of the things that we knew before. So really good change in government requires business change. People who understand their staff, thinking around what does it really look like to the front end user? How does it feel to reorganize your business? And then also really good transformation is step back and think about your business process, strip out the steps that you don't need. And so we're in a really, I would say, kind of really double down actually on good business change, thinking about your users, be they staff or the public. And so my big takeaway is actually it is true. The technology is probably not the hardest thing now. There are some features of it which are really genuinely unique around how do you maintain confidence in what it's putting out. Turns out, one of our really big challenges is how do we have confidence in what we're doing now in terms of good MI, good business intelligence about what is being done by our staff, because you're now trying to start coding some of that or putting it into probabilistic tools. So my kind of big takeaway is to accelerate some of that is think about those. And then the other one is invest in people who really understand it and bring them into your civil service. So that's a really good example. We can't rely on external partners to do it all for us. We must rely on external partners to help us do it because we don't have all the skills and probably never will. But I think getting those individuals in your organisation who feel comfortable with understanding kind of machine learning and generative AI type tools, because then they can engage in really good business change.
All right. Chloe, you work with partners kind of from across government on this, so that gives you a kind of a wider lens, but also people in industry. I wonder kind of what your reflections are on how this is going, particularly in government, but maybe also a kind of compare and contrast.
I think, interestingly, we've been working with government for 2 decades now, and I think to Christoph's point, this isn't new. And if I think about machine learning and AI, it's been embedded in our technology for about 10 years. I think closing the digital skills gap and upskilling our citizens, civil servants, colleagues and partners to utilise and deploy the technology is really, really important. That is why we've invested 45 million over the next 5 years and have put our AI centre, our global AI centre here in London. I think in terms of government and the adoption of AI, I would say stop trying to build it. When there is technology and there are solutions out there. If we think about research and development, somebody talked about money earlier. I can't remember, it was at the back of the room. And if I want to talk in real money terms, we're investing 6 billion a year on R&D into AI. So I think for government departments to not lean into vendors, to technologists, to actually get thought leadership and best practice around implementation is perhaps a mistake. You don't need to build your own. If you've decided to build your own, bring some of that with you for sure. We can work with that. But actually, I think now GDS is opening up that conversation, inviting all vendors into the room. That's a wholly positive thing. Because I think if we look at public service reform and the link to AI and enabling technology, I think technology is probably the greatest platform for change.
You've touched on a couple of themes I want to expand on, but I promise they're in my next question, so we're going to come back to it. And I guess, Liam, the incubator for AI is kind of in the broad sweep of history. It's still a relatively new bit of government, but this is bread and butter for you guys in the day job. You've also, since the last of these conferences we've been through a machinery of government change, as part of a wider reset of the digital centre. Kind of, what are your reflections coming out the other side of that?
Yeah, I suppose maybe to start off with a headline thought, to Chloe's point, I think we both need to build it. I think government and the private sector working together is the best of both worlds there. But when I look at AI adoption within government, it feels like there's a growing sense of confidence which is emerging. We're seeing many different teams beyond the incubator, like the Justice AI unit, which is just set up, SCDO is setting up its own AI team, MHCLG just got funding for its own team as well. Policing also. So there is these centres of excellence which are emerging, which I'm hoping will make it a lot easier to interact with government on AI, because there will be some technical people across the table who know, what's being asked for, and they're not making contracts which, maybe don't hit the key user need at the heart of that. But equally, there's, I think a real need for a centre of technical excellence within government, frankly, just to inform our policy profession counterparts. We're in a whole new world of technology and AI as it's emerging, and we want to be able to help advise, along with our private sector counterparts, how this is going to impact government by building some of that technology and addressing some of the areas which private sector doesn't address.
Okay. That's helpful. Now, I'm gonna try and expand on a couple of themes that you've all brought up. But it seems to me what you're talking about kind of together is a world of doing AI at scale, and that the world of using these tools at scale day to day is going to look and feel like qualitatively quite different to maybe previous eras of reform where the relationship between the public and private sectors is going to have been different. The kind of talent and workforce requirements are going to need to be different, but also the conversation with the public's different. And so I guess as we enter this kind of age of scale in using AI in government, I'm maybe just going to ask each of you kind of like concretely, what's one thing which you would like to see more of, kind of a bit of best practice or something? Maybe, Sapna, can we start with you?
I think there's also an expectation from users that they're going to have, whether that be frontline probation officers or whoever it might be, that they're going to have this technology available to them in their day-to-day work. So it's being able to deliver that in a way that most effectively helps them with their caseloads. And I think we need to meet that challenge in terms of we're pushing more and more work potentially to various groups. How are we going to use technology to help them in their day-to-day work? And that could be through, there's lots of massive documents that they need to look through. How can we use AI to easily extract information, show them easily what pages have been highlighted? There's lots of relatively simple things, and I think it goes back to Chloe's point around we don't need to start from scratch here. Lots incubator doing lots of work, and then also a lot of organisations that we can collaborate with and learn from and potentially buy some things as well. So what are those things that are going to have the most impact? Really need to understand what is going to be the impact, how do we measure that, and then can we build the case for rolling those things out?
Christoph, you talked a bit about talent and external talent in particular, but there might be something else. Like what's top of your wish list for the kind of the world of AI at scale? Yeah,
I'm going to cheat and say one thing, which is better communications, and I'm going to squeeze two things in there. So the first one is don't talk about AI. Stop talking. I'm an evangelist, just in case anybody worries about it. But can we start talking about the kind of what is the experience of the user, the caseworker, or the public member who is interacting with the service which is powered by AI? So that's kind of like one thing. And I think a lot of our conversations are, oh, look, here's some AI, here's some ML, etc. And the second thing that is the kind of the complex counterpart to that is we've got to find really good ways of talking about how these things work. I work on live facial recognition. There's a really tricky question around what's positive, false positives, false negatives. How do you communicate that effectively? And I think my favorite example was saying, well, look, you'd have to walk in front of the camera 6,000 times for you to be incorrectly identified as being somebody there. The number's much bigger now, by the way, because of work that's been done to deal with that. But how do you engage with a member of staff or a member of public that is saying, I'm now using this generative AI tool embedded into some workflow, and it might make some mistakes, but we've thought really hard about what those look like, and your user experience is now much, much more positive. So I think communicating really effectively, and that, going back to an earlier point, is a partnership thing between industry, civil society groups, government, being able to really, really clearly communicate. And that feels to me like one of our biggest challenges now, and also a huge opportunity to engage the public and others in a really fascinating moment around transformation in government.
Fantastic, thank you. I guess, Chloe, you talked about partnership. Christoph's just echoed that, but a new sense of partnership between the public and private sectors. Now that can look like a lot of different things, but at the core of it, there's a buyer-seller relationship, and a knowledge exchange relationship, and a kind of talent, ecosystem relationship. On buying and selling specifically, how do we relate to the private sector? Like, what looks best practice to you guys? What would you like to see more of from government as a partner?
I think government is already looking extensively at the private sector in terms of how they support customers to help benefit how we support our citizens. I think in terms of our relationship with government, it is a strategic partnership, but it's one that's built on trust. That's our number one value. So not only do we have that as a value in our organisation, I think it needs to be deeply embedded in your AI and your technology. And I think for citizens to have trust, both in the commercial and the private sector, the public sector as well as the commercial sector, is really, really essential. But I just want to go back to Stockman's point about automation and process and paper. I knew Christoph not wanting to talk about AI. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that there is a lot of data challenge that remains within government. Government is awash with paper, literally pieces of paper, you know, and real people are processing that paper. So those forms that you were talking about, we've got the technology that can help to scan, read, identify fields and cells within a form, and actually then take action on those insights. And I think, you know, we're talking about AI today, but our customers, my government customers, are talking to me about agents. They're talking about digital labour, working alongside human labour. So that's another partnership that we need to explore. How do we create a future where we do have digital and human labour working hand in hand?
So there may be a couple of different kinds of partnerships going on here, which I think are interesting and good to tease out. Liam, I'm going to ask you about a different one, which is pertinent to the incubator's role, to the digital centre, which is, you know, we're re-architecting how central government works slightly. The last era of kind of wholesale digital adoption and transformation in government was marked by kind of one kind of GDS, its delivery approach, and these kind of common products and capabilities across government. What's the current theory of change from the centre? You know, how do you want to work differently with, let's say, departments at the start of this, but maybe other public services as well?
Yeah, I'd say the paradigm is somewhat different for artificial intelligence. Like, the central part here is that this is quite a novel and emerging technology, which is changing from week to week to week. Something which was impossible 6 months ago suddenly is extremely possible today. And in fact, it only costs 10 pence to do it, you know, for hundreds of people. I think there has to be a slightly more experimental approach to the way in which you approach AI. So traditional service delivery is more of that kind of waterfall style, you know, approach of, we know we need to build this service, we're going to keep going until we get it done. Whereas I think with AI, because there are so many potential applications in order to get those outcomes that Christoph was referring to, we need to be able to be a bit more ruthless in saying that, oh, we need to drop this project here because we think the technology isn't ready. 2 months' time, maybe we'll pick it back up. So I think one of the things I'd like departments to be better at, frankly, is being a bit more ruthless with where they put their energy, and equally knowing that it's okay that something fails. We have lots of pilots in the UK government, lots of them, and I think it's okay if some of them die. I think that's the core message there. But equally, you know, recognizing when, oh, the private sector has entered into this market, it's cheap as chips, and we can deploy that at scale. Those kinds of opportunities, we've got to be ruthless, we've got to be opportunistic in how we see where we can apply AI, whether it be internally developed or external.
And I want to just briefly expand on that theme on pilots and what the kind of development cycle of these projects look like, because I think I'm conscious that's an easy thing to say, but sometimes a hard thing to practice in government. And I know that feeling when you're working on a public project and it's not going very well. So, like, what are your kind of culture tips, or how would you like to see those conversations change?
Yeah, I think the incubator, right, as a organization, I think we're something like 18 months old, maybe a little bit older, pretty new on the block. And when we first emerged, departments didn't take us seriously. And I think rightfully so. If you're DWP and we're saying, hi, we think we can help you out, I can understand why they might see if we survive the year and, you know, then go from there. So we worked on projects which we knew we could do on open data, on legislation, on Hansard, on all of these big public data sets in order to build that trust. I think in the early days, maybe the first 6 months of the incubator, you could definitely have accused us of innovating in a corner. We were having great impact in the Cabinet Office, but we weren't necessarily scaling that up to many, many departments. Now, it's a lot more about the strong bilateral connections we have with teams like the Justice AI Unit, like FCDO AI, international teams in France and Ukraine. Building up those connections is how we start to have much more trust with these, you know, large delivery departments. And then we can actually help them with some of our centralized expertise, but also our connections out to industry. So I think it takes time, and it also takes time for departments to get over some of the learned helplessness of, you know, delivering technology in government, because it is very hard. And often we have really, you know, executive level sponsorship of yes, change the system from ministers. At the low levels as well, at the front line, at the coalface, everybody wants their jobs to be easier so they can focus on more value add for citizens. But it's getting that through the middle, which is the tricky part. And it feels like now the middle is starting to thaw in a major way.
That's great. I'm going to take the opportunity as well to shamelessly plug our research paper with the same title as this panel, coincidentally, from September, which tries to address some more of those kind of issues of how do we do AI at scale in government. So, if you want to find out more after this panel, please go and read it.
It's a very good paper.
Endorsement, that's fantastic. We'll have you back for sure. Okay, kind of final question from me for all panelists, and then I'm going to kind of open it up. We're kind of lucky to have hindsight, but we're also maybe kind of still early in this process. AI is one of the fastest evolving technologies in the world, if not the fastest. Every day we're seeing new kind of frameworks, approaches, use cases emerging. And I'm going to ask, what's the either the use or the new kind of technological development which you're each most optimistic about? And for a change, I'm going to start at the far end and come back down this way. So Liam, can I go to you first?
Yeah, I think Chloe was alluding to it earlier. Agents is this next kind of paradigm that we're seeing emerging, right? But the problem we have is a lot of government data which is relevant for those agents. It's locked up in PDFs from the 1970s which haven't been digitized. So I think government, one of its big strategic focuses should be how do we make our knowledge assets? All of these papers written by fantastic civil servants, which sadly have only ever been read twice. That's a tragic reality of a lot of documents made in government. So if we can make all of that available to these larger ecosystems of agents in Copilot, in Google Workspace, and Salesforce, whatever it might be, we can bring the government expertise and the specialist knowledge to the ecosystem and to everybody who works in the policy profession. I think that's a key focus for me.
Great stuff. Chloe?
Looking at that paper, those PDFs, I can definitely help you with that.
Let's have a chat.
I just wanted to talk specifically actually about agents. So I had the pleasure of listening to a customer talk about our technology just last week at World Tour, and it was a customer from Northern Trains, and they deployed their first agent, and they'd utilised their user accessibility group. So it was a group of customers, travellers, who actually needed accommodation and adjustments to ensure that their journey went well, that they were supported on arrival at the right platform, the elevators were working. And actually what was very powerful about this, it was a very simple use case, but it was actually built on their own frequently asked questions, which they knew weren't great. They knew it wasn't the best, and they were, they had a programme of work to improve it. And over time, very quickly, I think it's been in live for 7 weeks, the AI had already started to repair their frequently asked questions. So it had already started to help them build and repair and improve the data that they had. So I think agents are the future. Agents are in deployment. Government is utilising agents today. And actually, it's not that difficult to build an agent. And, we bring customers from our commercial world in on a regular basis into a Salesforce Innovation Centre, and they're building agents in less than a day. So I think for me, it's sort of start small, think big. So have that big vision, but don't let the challenge of data, the unstructured data, the PDFs, the stuff you can't access, stop you getting started. Start and do the two things in tandem.
Yeah, I must say, I was at the AI Summit of London Tech Week last week, and the emergent conceptual framework of agents was just ubiquitous. And actually, I think it's a remarkably helpful one, because thinking around these tools and, compacted in various ways as someone who works for you and supervising them to make sure they do the things they're meant to do and giving them really good instructions is a really easy way of engaging with some of these tools. And actually also turning them to supervisors. So we've been thinking about how do you turn this into someone who gives guidance to a junior caseworker. We've got things like policy search, etc. So I think it's a really interesting framing. Just got to make sure it doesn't hide some of the detail that sits in there, around how do these things really work. The thing that really excites me, though, as I was saying earlier, actually, is for a hugely complex technology, it's remarkably easy for people to get their heads around it. And actually, I've seen some, in 2 or 3 days, some kind of proofs of concept with the senior caseworkers, a policy person, and a group of technologists who are able to decompose and then reconstruct a business workflow and provide a higher degree of transparency to the problem that they were trying to do than we have ever been able to do. And that was in 2 days. And instead of going off and writing a waterfall program, you know, waterfall thing and doing some business cases, etc., you are able to do the proof of concept. Flip around that, the thinking then differently about how we do projects and programs, the digitization and the organization of our data. This stuff is only possible because of decades of work by lots of people to get ourselves off locked in legacy systems, off paper. So keeping those things together, I think, is going to be really key. But I'm genuinely excited about how much it draws people into a conversation with policy, ops, and tech, and how you can group those things together to kind of power through what has traditionally been, I've done some work, I throw it over, I do some more work, I throw it over, and then turn back and find out that the original work didn't quite work. So I think something really exciting about how you operate, making agile feel real in a way in which I think it probably wasn't even 5 years ago.
Yeah, a good, interesting way of putting it. A kind of quicker time to impact, kind of changing a lot of the rules of the game. And Sam, funny, kind of what are you optimistic about?
Yeah, I think just AI being seen as part of transformation, whether that be digital transformation, policy transformation, it's not a separate thing, and I think that's really key in getting from that, I guess, when we're working with like AI and others, is how does it fit in to the work that's already being done in the department? Because I think that's where the most success can be seen. And then a huge one for me is improving our data quality. If we can bring in more data, some of those traditional machine learning algorithms we've had, actually bringing in some of the case note data into that makes them much more powerful, much more useful to the people who are using them. So I think those are the two bits. So one is it's not seen as separate, it's part of transformation. And then secondly is the improvement we can get in data quality from so many different aspects of AI is really exciting.
Okay, that's fantastic, thank you. We're now going to take questions from the audience, and I'm going to try and take a few at a time. I think we have our roving mics like we did last time. So yeah, I'm going to take a question from Amy first, and then we'll take a round of a few.
Thank you. Amy Gandon, I'm a freelance researcher, including doing some work for the good people at Restate. I'm interested, I suppose this is a government which has kind of two potentially competing imperatives. One being, obviously, using AI and technology to kind of drive efficiency, and obviously this is a tricky moment fiscally for the government as well, so there are lots of cost pressures and hopes being pinned to AI in terms of replacing parts of the civil service workforce potentially. And on the other hand, an imperative, particularly in kind of public service reform world, that, you know, this can be a government that delivers more human-centered, more relational public services at the same time. So I'm curious, especially those of you working in government, how are you experiencing those kind of competing imperatives, and how can we ensure that we have like a considered conversation about where we implement AI and actually where we try and invest in continuing to have kind of person-to-person relationships in government?
Okay, fantastic question. Thank you, Amy. Just the lady on the far side there, far right-hand side.
Thank you. Grace from the Future Governance Forum actually really relates to that question. I'm interested in often the conversation around AI in terms of public service reform is about kind of freeing up the caseworker to do more relational work by clearing the desk of bureaucracy. And I'm interested in kind of innovations where AI could be used to actually deliver more relational services for citizens.
Okay, perfect, fantastic. Two very similar questions that can make my life a lot easier. And then, yeah, far side, Greg, over there.
Greg Rosen, Sec Newgate and former consultant director at Restate. Some of the most brilliant and inspirational and clever people I know work in AI, and they know far more about it than me. And one of the points that they make to me, and I'm sure to others, is that AI is brilliant, has the capacity to be brilliant, but is not yet as perfect as it could be. In particular, that it hallucinates, that it makes in effect slightly random mistakes that cannot yet be proofed for. Given the controversy around AI and the need to maintain trust from the citizens, how big a risk is it that that government fails in its enthusiasm for AI to take into account this risk of hallucination? And I give the case study of the recent peat map that DEFRA put out, spent 5 million quid on, and as the Times revealed, full of mistakes. But DEFRA has still got it up on the website, doesn't acknowledge anything is wrong, yet everyone can see that there are problems with it all over the Twitter sphere. How do you encourage Whitehall to take ownership of the imperfections of it so that the credibility of AI is maintained and improved?
Fantastic question. And given we had two quite similar ones, I'm going to go for one. I'm going to go to Charlie at the back, Sean, if you wouldn't mind.
Sorry to ask a question, but one of the things that we have written several times in our papers is actually that we don't have the right level of risk assessment. And so we are we're sort of assessing the risk of applying AI without having a proper baseline of the risk of not applying AI. So, people are biased in the same way that AI is biased. That's partly why a lot of justice information is biased, right? Because people are biased. I think we'd all also say that most public services currently are struggling, so isn't the worst thing to let them keep on struggling than to try? And so how do we rethink how we baseline what risk actually looks like when we're applying these technologies?
That's a fantastic set of questions. I'm going to take them roughly in order to Amy's and kind of Grace's question about what's our kind of our framework and our approach to thinking about where does humanity matter, where does efficiency matter, and how much those things are in tension. Is it right if I come to you first, and then maybe Sam, I might ask you as well, if that's right.
Absolutely. I think AI has the opportunity to make our services far more human than they currently are. One of our first projects we did was Caddy. It's with Citizens Advice. Imagine if you volunteered to work with Citizens Advice and you're on the phone responding to a vulnerable person. You're maybe 2 weeks into the job, and the person asks a question that you don't know the answer to. One of the things we built was an AI system to help advise the advisor. So not an AI directly talking to somebody in a vulnerable situation, but talking to the person in the middle and having an expert person who's worked maybe at Citizens Advice for 10, 20 years who can approve that and send that out to people. What does that lead to? Well, we ran a randomized control trial to test the efficacy of this and to see how much it was hallucinating. Our advisors were far more confident in the advice that they were giving to vulnerable people in the moment with that kind of a system. So I think the first element when it comes to any AI project is the design. It's where the user need is, and it's how you can most elegantly fit AI into that picture in a safe and responsible way. And it takes a lot of testing to make sure that that's being done right. We look at the amount of money saved with that project, but one of the big things which we did is also look at satisfaction of the people who were giving advice, but also the people who actually asked for it. So I think basing it in outcomes is absolutely critical for making sure that you're aligning in a right way towards the use of AI.
You're saying the two things are not always in tension, and we shouldn't always accept that premise almost.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess there will be some cases where it is. I'm conscious that the justice system deals with some people kind of at their most vulnerable, and their sense of confidence in it is going to be really tied up in the people they interact with and how. How do you think about this tension, human-centric design and kind of need for efficiency? Because also, justice system has kind of huge cost and performance pressures as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's always thinking about that. What is that new user need, and thinking about efficiency, but then also, are we helping people to make better decisions? So can we tell both stories? How are we doing the efficiency part, but also helping people to make better decisions? I think some of this comes back to that data point. Can we get really good labeled data to test? Because I think in some of the cases we've had, it's people are trying to, for intelligence purposes, look through millions of messages, and they can't physically, they can't do that. So building a tool that can extract information using machine learning or AI capabilities will mean that they have more time to spend with the vulnerable people.
I think there you're talking, there's an interesting set of use cases in the kind of Venn diagram where the plausibility of a human, it's just implausible that a human public servant is doing that activity at all just because of the scale of it, where I think we need a new approach almost.
Yeah, and I think we see that across for the Justice Service. We need to understand data from the Police National Computer, data from CPS, data from HMCTS. It's a huge volume, and to do that in a timely manner as well. So some of the data linking algorithms we have, and we're building a new system called Core Person Record, which is using open source data linking algorithms that we built. And that will link together data for the first time across our prisons and probation system. And so that's one area where we have records, say 40 times for an individual. We're able to now say, okay, that is one individual, and we can save a lot of time there.
And having looked at some of that data firsthand, I can tell you that that is a very, very tricky problem to solve. So more power to your arm. I'm gonna try and sort of similarly bucket Greg and Charlie's questions together, but as a kind of another tension, right? There's a kind of there's an issue in running public services, which I think has long been acknowledged around how do we maintain public trust and confidence in something which is probabilistic and can make mistakes. And there's a flip side to that, which is, current human-delivered public services are also, relatively probabilistic, make plenty of mistakes. In fact, that's partly how we get here. And maybe we don't think of those two things on the same level. That's not to say we should, but there's a set of issues that unpacks about how we think about risk and opportunity and cost and benefit. Maybe Christoph and then Chloe, can I kind of ask you about that?
Yeah. So, uncertain failure modes is kind of, it's a classic problem. It's, engineers have dealt with that for quite some time. And hallucinations is a really good example. By the way, the biggest problem I have is about not finding stuff in an unknown manner rather than actually finding stuff and making it up, because I can more easily say that is made up in various ways. But ignoring things is a real problem in that. I think there are two solutions. And we often talk about data as like being a big issue. Increasingly for me, the data that I care about is management information and business intelligence on the operation of one of my systems. And I think we do not have enough of it to be able to baseline, to your earlier comment, baseline, how good is this human process? Therefore, I can now have confidence that this machine-augmented process with these agents who are now doing certain tasks for me is as good or better than it. And I think probably fair, we should ask for a higher degree of effectiveness from some new unproven test technique, but we've got to get the baseline data. So MI, BI, which relates to kind of how you design the system, is really important. Second one is accountability and transparency. That's how I think you deal with it. So we are really clear that an algorithmic system that sits somewhere in the Home Office has a business owner. It has someone who has to understand the process that has gone into making that thing work. And it feels really we've trialed a adopt an algorithm program where we take the business owner through, the development of the early years, adolescence, you're testing it, you're trying it, maturity, you've still got to keep an eye and supervise them. And I think that accountability and transparency is a kind of a long-standing principle in the way in which we do public service. And then it is for somebody to make a judgment, say, I've got a choice here, and I'm going to cheekily answer the first question around what we do. Look, my rule of thumb is if you're going to make 100% of whatever saving, take 100% saving of 10 minutes, 7 of that minutes bank it as a saving, 20 minutes unlock the empathy of your staff members to go and work with someone, 2 minutes rather, and 1 minute go and learn something new, invest in your staff. You've still made a 70%, a 7-minute saving, but actually you're then choosing what you do with the spare time. And I think certainly from a place like the Home Office, we have to think about using it to empathise, to be curious. And that's where I think some of the most interesting changes for our caseworkers or staff is going to be. But coming back to the answer I was meant to be giving, I think accountability and transparency and really good data on how these systems and processes work is going to be kind of absolutely key to maintaining public confidence.
So in the private sector, you'll be reckoning with these kind of problems, the tensions around kind of performance, risk, accountability, and to some extent, how do we prove that? How do we assess that? The management information. What should government be thinking about there?
I think just to extend on what Christoph said, yes, the transparency, the accountability for leadership, but also the trust. And I think, you know, as a citizen first, you know, I want to have more trust in government. I want to have better outcomes for myself, my family, my children. And I think citizens really are empowering government now to move forward. Backlogs are a huge factor here. It doesn't matter whether that's the Department of Health and Social Care. It doesn't matter whether that's the courts backlog. As citizens, we're not experiencing the level of service we would like. And I think you mentioned it earlier, experimentation. I would encourage more experimentation, probably under, let's say, the MOU, to stand some of these projects and programs up, proof of concept, proof of delivery, because over time the AI will improve, and the more experimentation we do, the better outcomes you will have for your departments. And I think we can then start to put more metrics and KPIs in for directors of department that's related to the outcomes from AI, and more accountability. But I would just say more experimentation. The more we work with the tooling and the technology, the more we will learn, and the better those outcomes for citizens will be.
And is it, for citizens' expectations, do you think it's a problem that the gap, the size of the gap that's opening up between what people experience just in their private lives or in their relationship with certain kind of big businesses in particular, and their interaction with public services? I think when I first started working on this 7 years ago, there was very little thought was given to the way that particularly generative AI might have been deployed and experienced. We've all got it on our phone and we can very easily prompt it, get feedback, and as Christoph says, it's intuitive. Like, at what point is that gap in expectations a problem?
I think the gap's huge, and I think the expectation we have on government is, you know, accelerating. And I think to your point around process and actually speed, if I think about wanting to purchase or procure an item, whether it be a pair of shoes, you know, that vendor knows where I live, it knows what I last bought, it knows what style I like, it may even know what size my feet are, it may know my delivery preferences. But the reality is, you know, every year, annually, I get a thud on the mat, actually from the DWP. It's the Disability Living Allowance form for my son. No, it's that deep. I fill it in by hand. It gets sent back, and it's often rejected. It's reading, it's taking a human to read my handwriting and to input that data. Yet, my son has a congenital chromosome duplication. That is in his health records. He has a social worker that sits with the Department of Health and Social Care. He's in education, so he has an educational care plan. That should all be connected. I expect that to be connected. You know, certainly by 2030, that would be utopic for me, for government to be able to have a unique citizen record of my child that will help him transition from children's services into adult services. It seems so simple. And I think if we look at the private sector and private health, I used to lead health and life sciences in our commercial industries at Salesforce, you know, they are accelerating away from us. And actually people are opting out of public service on that basis. So I'd just like to see a future where as a citizen, we can have better access to our data. That data can be shared cross-departmentally for public good, and we can speed up essential services for citizens.
Fantastic, thank you. I hope those questions aren't that my microphone has died, otherwise we've got a problem. But it looks like people can hear me. We've got time for, I think, another round of 3 questions. So yeah, just the gentleman at the far back.
This is a really interesting discussion.
Sorry, could you just, your name and where you're from?
Sorry, Amit Chowdhury, KPMG. It's a really interesting discussion, and some of the insights the panel's provided, I really agree with, particularly the evolution of how AI has evolved and how accessible it now is. So the question, notwithstanding all of the other questions so far, is what is holding government back in accelerating its adoption now?
Brilliant, thank you. Very great question, to the point, which models exactly what we're after. Yeah, sure. Fabian, just in the second row.
Hi, Fabian Chestel from Policy and Practice. And I'm going to build on that last question because it goes to exactly sort of the point I want to raise. We heard earlier today that structure eats strategy for lunch, and I think regulation eats innovations for breakfast. Liam, you talked about wanting to kill programs earlier, but in a world where you can get your funding approved every 2 years in a spending review, like, who really would want to do that in that world? And in terms of the data, we know how incredibly hard it is to bring together the data from a huge number of disparate sources and then use it to train an AI model. I mean, try to prove proportionality to the level required for GDPR to do that. So my question is, what are the big regulations that stop you from doing what you need to do at the pace you want to be able to do it?
Okay, good question. Thank you. And then final question in this round. Yeah, if you just, the lady there. Thank you. Oh, thanks, Sean.
Thank you. Hello, Lara Sampson from Public Digital. I'm kind of heartened to hear, particularly from Christoph, that, I don't know, 10, 12 years after government started to work tried to start working in a more agile test and learn type way, AI might finally have released it, which is fantastic. But I am curious as to what leadership behaviours you think the civil service needs to develop in order for this to become a permanent new way of working.
Great question. Great set of three really quite different questions. I'm going to take Clara Amit's question first on what's holding us back. Kind of what do we need? What's next, and how do we really kind of grasp the metal on that? Christoph, can I go to you with that one?
Yes. So, leadership behaviour, sorry, I was just thinking through all the earlier one, the regulation. Right, I go for the regulation. Very little. I don't think there's very much regulation that gets in the way of us delivering improvements in this area. And I think what I often lack is people who understand those regulations. So I'll deliberately do one of my things. We spend millions on major change projects with lots of IT, and then I say, can we have like 5% of that to do the evaluation, to generate the MI, to enable me to gain the trust and confidence? Oh, no, that's minimum viable product. We'll do the MI later. It's like, no, we've got to switch that around. The MI on how these things operate, that you need to be able to show that you've understood the biases in the system now and in the future. Got to invest in that up front. I happen to have responsibility for bits of the Data Protection Act. I've not yet come across a single example where it was actually a barrier. The barrier was understanding risk, understanding what is necessary, what is proportionate, and giving really good advice. That said, as we push the boundaries, there will be limits. And I think there are some things which are barriers in terms of friction in the system. So getting better at doing some of these things, using generative AI to fill in data protection impact assessments, and then make sure the person who's looking at it really understands what the risks are to the data subject. That's where I want to take that spare time to use it. So I really think we can kind of obsess around the regulatory barriers to some of these things. I think the skills to understand them, to think really carefully about them, is where we are now. There are some things that will kind of hit the boundaries on.
Maybe just to expand on Fabian's question about regulation, Chloe, I'm going to kind of come to you and give you a chance to sort of elaborate on the private sector perspective on this. I mean, we try and keep the scope of these events very much focused on, kind of AI and the state and public services, but, the state is also the kind of biggest regulator of its own development of these technologies. I guess, you kind of encounter that both as a private entity and with customers. Kind of what are you thinking about in those conversations?
Well, I think, our private sector, they've sort of blazed a trail. They may have been slightly early adopters, but their doors are really wide open to government. And actually, it's surprising how many government departments are asking for referenceability from our commercial world. So those connections and relationships are being built and established. And I think that's really, really important when we look at scale. And I think, like most organisations, most government departments think they're particularly complex or very unusual. And the reality is they're not that complex or unusual to us. And if we look into our private business, when we've got large-scale organisations doing multiple things, actually simplifying your estate and helping government do things a little bit better, faster, quicker, actually cheaper. But I just wanted to go back to agents, how role enriching that can actually be for civil servants who are doing repetitive, perhaps boring tasks and actually want to be dealing with more vulnerable customers or specialising. So I think there are real benefits to actually deploying that technology to improve the working day of your colleagues. But yeah, I think our private organisations are perhaps slightly further ahead, but in terms of outcomes and the complexity of government, not the estate, actually your world can be more critical and can be more complex. And I think if we look to the US or Australia and the large transformations we're doing out there, we can draw on that knowledge and share that back in to the UKI, and I think that's super, super helpful, particularly when it comes to justice, actually.
And I want to make sure I give Amit a chance to answer his question. So I was going to come to you on this one. What holds you back? What do you not have which you would like? You know, you're at the coalface of some of this. This is your chance to tell a room full of people who might be able to help you in some way. And God knows, we certainly would like to be at a think tank. What next? Because it might become our next research paper.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be news, but that siloed thinking, I think trying to break out of that, we've had like cross criminal justice system programs of work for such a long time now, and it's still each department has its own objectives. And I think if we could, back to Chloe's point, it's a real shame we can't solve that, because I think every time we do go to solve it, it's too few work programs within a department are geared towards solving that cross-citizen issue. But I think that's a huge one. We could share so much more. We talk about open source. Do we make enough stuff open source? Or we had a sharing day last week with MOJ, AI innovation. But there's so much more we could do in terms of working together on joint work programs. I know that's a difficult one to get through Treasury, but I think that's the big one for me, is what could we do? And again, with the private sector, because each department seems to go out separately to the same organisations, whether you're working with local authority data and then separately with police, and everyone's going and knocking on one person's door. We could do that much more effectively as one government.
Thank you. And then, Liam, I'm going to ask you the question about kind of agile thinking and leadership behaviours. You know, my hunch is that if it hasn't happened already, at some point the incubator is going to be asked, you know, here are all your government departments, who's doing it well, who's not, and I know what that commission feels like. Kind of, you know, when you're taking that seriously and you're reflecting on what best practice is and how do you actually share it, like in really concrete terms, what do you want leadership to be doing differently?
Better theory of risk is the key thing here. So Charlie's question earlier around how do we have the risk laid out of what the system could do in a bad way, but equally, what's the cost of us not doing anything in this space? I feel like at the moment, what we tend to get is a lot of great, well-intentioned pilots, but as soon as it gets to the moment of, you know, rubber meeting the road in terms of getting it backing for compliance, you know, and all the rest of it, we tend not to have the right skills in place for people to scrutinize these projects, these tools, these, you know, technologies off the shelf that we might want to deploy effectively. And so it means that a leader in, inside these organizations will say, yes, let's adopt AI, and then it dies and they have no idea what happened in the middle. I think getting a better theory of risk so that everybody in the chain of delivery within government is talking in terms of not just the cons, but also the potential pros, which we might be leaving on the table, is absolutely key. But it's a cultural problem and not really a technological problem. Increasingly, code is cheap. Yeah.
You briefly want to come in? Yeah, briefly. I mean, kill the separate email chains and enable people to genuinely work as collaborative networks. So they get the compliance person, the technologist, the operational person in the room at the beginning, compartmentalize into a small enough place, and then have the trust and confidence that they can come up with something. I think that's a really uncomfortable leadership behavior. I say it for myself, it's kind of like, oh, I punted that over there, I've now got to let them get on with it, protect them for a bit, and they may come up with something quite terrifying, but they may also come up with something absolutely brilliant, and being able to monitor that and that relationship. I think it's a very different kind of leadership behavior than you often see in Whitehall, where you compartmentalize everything, drop it into a sort of series of things and put it together.
Just to build on your point, but also Sapna's, I think there is something here around how we share what we're all up to. Frankly, so much of how we deploy AI and what people are comfortable with is down to norms. A department where everybody's reading the latest AI announcements, they're a lot quicker in adopting the latest technology, whereas ones which don't. I think a pro tip, at least I've discovered, is that whenever you are talking to directors, deputy directors who own the problems, if you can say, hi, I know 2 other deputy directors who approach the problem in this way, and they're doing really well at that, would you like to do the same? And frankly, getting people talking to each other about how they're adopting technology destigmatizes it, and it encourages people to be a bit more risk-taking because they don't want to be the department that got left behind, right?
Fantastic. I think we have just about time enough for a quick fire round of questions. So that goes as much for you in the audience as it does for our panelist members and their answers. I'm going to ask people if they have remaining questions. You know, I'm still interested in your name, where you're from, but after that, short, sharp questions, which are questions, not your life story. Rosie, I know I can count on you for this.
Thanks. There seems to be a dissonance between the level of technology capability.
Rosie, where are you from and what's your
Do you think leapfrogging in technology by rolling out AI when we still don't have kind of clinical records or basic technology in hospitals, do you think that undermines or enhances the case for rolling out more advanced technology before you've got the basics right?
Rosie Beacon, head of our health programme as well.
Oh, sorry, yes,
for the
that's my
avoidance
name.
of doubt. Yeah, gentleman at the back there. Who's just got his hand.
Hi, I'm Ben from the House of Commons. I'm interested in where you think procurement fits into this. You're talking about a lot of quite innovative practices, but a lot of government technology is procured from incumbents. So yeah, curious for your thoughts on that. Thanks a lot.
That's a great question. And then final of our quick fire questions. Yeah, the lady just there.
Thanks. It's Liz Torcher from PA Consulting. I've just been interested in the panel's view on the top 3 things that we could do to do more to harness the enthusiasm that we've got across the public sector in terms of the workforce's role in delivering better outcomes. So how would you sell the opportunity and the excitement that AI presents to them in terms of their core reason for existing?
That's a great set. We don't have any contributors to the panel from the health ecosystem. I'm afraid, Liam, you're our closest bet, so I'm going to go to you first. I guess to expand on, I think kind of the common theme for everyone on Rosie's point is lots of public services are very distributed and decentralized. That deploying there looks different to how it does elsewhere. Does that strengthen the case for centralization of those public services, or is there something different going on?
I think centralizing the creation of AI tools to help digitize things. So that's our approach with Extract. We build a key capability, we roll it out to many local authorities to help them out. I think that's one of the key approaches, which I think will also be applicable to health. Sorry, how quick fire am I supposed to be?
That was pretty quick fire. I'm going to do the questions, so you might have a crack at the other questions in a sec.
Okay, wonderful.
Okay, and Chloe, did you want to come in quick fire answer on health? Give us
I'm
your...
also responsible for public health. I think she was actually looking at me, so I'm happy to come back on that. But I think the centralisation of procurement within health is going to be very, very interesting. And I think to be able to catalogue, publish, reuse and share innovation, so whether that be API usage, whether that be AI deployment, is going to be really, really helpful. And if we think about a patient journey being similar to a citizen journey or even a victim journey, in our policing, actually to be able to share the stories of that success, what data was used, I think that would increase adoption and roll it across health quicker.
Thank you very much. You've got onto the question of kind of procurement, and I want to come back to Ben's question. Quick fire, Christoph, I'm going to ask you for your short answer on this one, and I'll hold you to time. On procurement specifically.
Yeah, fine. So I think we just have to take the advantage of a much more agile way of procuring. An example that we're trying to look at, deepfake detection, those tools are radically changing really fast. So how do I maintain a list of those things which I would encourage people to procure, or indeed not even bother procuring, buy once and then provide that service through to multiple users? And I think it talks to Liam's point, language translation. How do I procure language translation tools for multiple users? Let's change the way we do it.
2 excellent use cases from our paper in September as well, just to flag. And I think it is still the case today, someone in the room might correct me, that the new competitive flexible procedure in the Procurement Act, which is meant to enable exactly what Christoph's talking about, despite being in place for a few months, has still not been used by any central government department. So if any of you are thinking of going to market, maybe ask your commercial teams about that one. Final question, and kind of Liz's question. I'm going to go to everyone on this, because I think this is such a good kind of cross-cutting one. How do we sell this? You've talked about different models, showing people the benefits of it, making them worried that their peers are taking advantage of and leapfrogging them, being really clear about what the risks of not doing it are and aren't. I'm going to ask everyone, what's the single best way to get cut through? Should we go down the line? Sam?
I think it's making it real for people and really helping telling that impact. I think we're still not there. I think we do these pilots and we don't have then the the money set aside for proper evaluation, and so be able to tell that story in a way that feels real for people, and we can understand what our baseline is, so we can do that evaluation effectively.
Okay, that's helpful. Better evaluation, the secret.
There's no tool that your staff can't destroy. Take them with you on the journey. Absolutely, and it's classic user change, business change experience. Build that in at the beginning and then work your way back through to the technology. If your staff are going to engage it. Sheep dipping is a place for that, but learning by doing. Sheep dipping training, you know, all that kind of, everybody's got to have a bit of AI literacy, but there's nothing more powerful than working with a group of people, playing, learning with the tools and then deploying them, and then being your change agents through the organisation.
Really shout about it. I mean, quite unlike the private side, I often find that the civil servants are a lot quieter about their successes, and I think, you know, the departments need to hear and understand what's going well and where you're making an impact, but more importantly, so do the citizens. I think there's a lot of firefighting, there's a lot of stuff that comes out that's not great, but actually when you do things really, really well, you never say so.
I definitely agree with that. But equally, I think skills is such a key one. Whitehall orthodoxy, the generalist is king. I think we've got to have much more, you know, DDAT skills, which I know the government is focused on, but bringing in those technical skills, paying the right level to get those people in, hugely important for having the right talent on the other side of the table to make sure that a project is built right, and when you're procuring something, you're actually getting a candid view of what people are asking for.
I think it's brilliant that we started today with Christoph's injunction, don't talk about AI, and then we've managed almost an hour and 10 minutes of doing it straight, and we've ended at the place of shout about it more and louder. We've got a real, we always try and get a real diversity of views on the panel, and I think we've really had that represented today. We're very nearly at time. I'm going to exert chair's privilege to get the final word and question from everyone. If there is one use case in your personal or work life which you would like to see the government automate away, you never have to touch it again, or you can a bit if you want, and that's your preference, but what is it?
Spending review.
I don't actually think we have anyone from the Treasury in the audience, but we'll make sure that gets back to them. The spending review, okay. Chloe.
I mentioned mine, but we'll
Yeah.
repeat it. It's really important. DLA and DWP, I'd really like to see those citizens that need that essential funding to have healthier, happier lives, have a much easier shake through process and get that funding sooner.
Christoph?
The chase my case phone calls in every single one. So DWP, Home Office, CJS, where's my case? Where have you got to? We should be killing those. They should be instantly available to the public.
Okay, fantastic. Sam?
Yeah, much more user-facing applications, I think, for, at the moment, it's kind of send something into government. Yeah. I don't really know where it's gone, what's happened. People can see I'm very pregnant, and moved to hospitals, and it's impossible for me to see things from one to another. So yeah, I think that sharing of data we talked about, but yeah, much more user-focused applications.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's the first time we've tried a quick fire round and people have actually stuck to it, so I really appreciate it. That's a brilliant panel. Thank you so much. I have no doubt that we'll be here or potentially a different venue in a year's time talking about AI in government. And once again, the landscape will have been completely changed. But you're all welcome back then. All that's left to do is thank our panelists for speaking. So thank you very much. Oh, yes, and if you could just stay seated for the next session, we'll be moving straight into that, so thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone. If I can ask everybody to be seated again. If there's anyone who hasn't managed to find a seat, there are a few at the front, so you don't have to do the embarrassing walk to the front if anyone does want to come and sit down before we kick off. No? People happy standing? Okay, perfect. So this is our final session of the day, and brilliant to end with a minister coming to talk to us about their vision, the things that they're doing. I am absolutely thrilled to have Minister Gould, Parliamentary Secretary at the Cabinet Office. It's quite unusual to have a minister in a role who has actually done the stuff before, but as I'm sure you all know, Georgia Gould has led mission government in Camden, is a true public service reformer, has actually done this on the ground and transformed services in a local area. So it is both fantastic to have someone who has experience in the role that you're doing here today, but also that clearly is such a passionate advocate of making sure that our public services work for people, they're delivered in the most efficient, effective way, and they're delivered with purpose, understanding that actually people's lives are deeply impacted by what the state does on a day-to-day basis. So I'm thrilled that we have Minister Gould here. She's going to give us a keynote address, and then we will sit down and I will have the joy of being able to do a little bit of in conversation and then open it up to everyone for questions. Minister Gould, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for the incredibly kind words, and it's wonderful to be here. I think this is your first event as Restate, so to celebrate the new name, and I was here for a little bit of a conversation earlier and got very excited about the procurement discussion. You were actually quite lucky I didn't storm the stage. Anyone who works with me knows I'm really into procurement. I was genuinely at a wedding recently and started talking very excitedly about government procurement and just saw like one by one everyone like, just gonna get a drink actually. But hopefully this is an audience that can embrace that discussion. Sapna, who leads on civil service reform, has been kind of keeping me up to date with a discussion this morning. So I know it's been a really fruitful and deep discussion, and that reform, Restate, the artist formerly known as Reform, over a long period has done a huge amount of thinking about public sector reform, about how we do things differently, and today builds on that massive legacy. And I think we've also heard today the strength of the case for change, and something I certainly feel, but also how hard that can sometimes be. And I remember something that really brought this home to me as I went to my first senior salaries review body, and I was, full of confidence and all my great new ideas, and I kind of talked about them very passionately. And then one of the very experienced reviewers was like, well, that's all well and good, but I've got some notes here that says Mo Molan said all of this 25 years ago, and what are you going to do that's different? So I feel like I'm a little bit more world weary, but also equally really determined to make that change. And I think one of the real joys of the role has been getting to know the civil service. And as a new MP and a minister, I've been really grateful to the civil servants that I've met, who just the depth of their expertise and their desire to serve the public. And I've been able to get out around the country talking to civil servants in lots of the different hubs. And, the overwhelming thing that people always say is that they choose to work in these jobs because they want to serve the public and they want to make a difference. But they also talk about some of their frustrations with how the system is working, how hard it can be to get things done, some of the silos, the layers, lots going up, but not everything coming back down, and just some of the basic things that don't work. You were talking about the future of AI, but just basic IT systems not talking to each other, issues with passes and laptops. This is something I experienced myself. 3 months in, my pass stopped working, and I went to get it looked at, and they said, actually, it's only been set up for 3 months. And I don't know if that was a vote of confidence in myself or just, says something about the average span of a ministerial career over the last 10 years. But, these are small things, but they really make a difference in terms of productivity and how easy it is to do people's jobs. And the civil service is a historic institution, and there's just so much to be proud of about that. The seamless handover of power that just happened, the professionalism with which that was done, the depth of the values of impartiality and integrity. And I think, these are very deeply embedded and shouldn't be taken for granted. But some of that depth of history means it's been set up really for a slower world, a less complex world, a more hierarchical world. And I think we can all feel that the structures we have are not fit to meet this new world. Departments are far too siloed when all the challenges we face are deeply complex and connected, and an all-knowing centre can't solve all the problems in every corner of the UK. And I think we have brilliant people who are stuck in systems that don't work and aren't able to achieve what they are capable of, and we need to change that. And I think at the heart of that is how we work hand in hand with local and regional government, businesses, house builders, the front line and communities. And I feel really, really excited about the potential of missions to deliver this. As you were saying, I'm incredibly passionate about missions. And I came to missions during COVID. I was leading Camden Council and chairing London Councils. And we saw in that time just the urgency of the task in front of us. And we did things, within days and weeks that in previous times would have taken us years, like huge changes, bringing everyone who was homeless in off a street, setting up new food distribution networks. And we managed to work completely differently with businesses and the voluntary sector, new partnerships. We cut through the kind of barriers and red tape that stops things happening. And we did it because the challenge was so immediate and we needed to work differently. And I really wanted to bring that same sense of energy and pace and purpose to the long-term challenges that we saw that we hadn't made progress in, and some of which were really exposed by COVID, the depth of health inequality or food poverty. So we developed 4 missions with our community, and over the years that we kind of went on this journey, I saw just how powerful the missions approach was, because it belonged to everyone, not just the council. And, there was a massive role for us as local government to deliver, but we were asking our communities, businesses, the voluntary sector to help. And over time, you started to see the power of all of that pulling together. From Google, who is a local employer, opening up a new AI campus for local young people, through to a young ex-offender who was working with young people at risk of going into being drawn into crime and talking to them about how to change their lives, through to us as a council investing in a community wealth fund, supporting young entrepreneurs. And these things started to connect, and action started to be taken that we had no idea about, that we hadn't incubated at the council. And we saw it break down silos between organisations and start to change the way we operated well beyond the individual missions. So for me, missions are about a new way of governing, one that is outward looking and drives new partnerships. And I think that a lot of the civil servants I speak to absolutely want to work in this way. But I think right now this is not routinely how government operates. The last survey, there was some really stark data about collaboration that said that less than half of people reported collaborating with civil servants in other departments and agencies to achieve common goals, whereas this should be the default way of working. So we need to deliver as government, but we also need to inspire, we need to catalyse, we need to form real partnerships. And I think there have been moments of really profound cross-governmental change. I was talking to Tamara Finkelstein recently about Sure Start, which was essentially a mission to really transform outcomes for children from when they were born, or One Login, which is a brilliant one government programme to make government much more accessible and seamless for citizens. But I think too often the default is not that. It is silos, it's centralisation, and it's doing things in a closed way. And it's very easy to see why that happens. The direct day-to-day accountability, political and financial, is in departments. The constant, intense media scrutiny is not a forgiving environment for mistakes or missteps. So there is an impulse sometimes to keep things tight, to have lots of checks, and it sometimes doesn't feel like there's a lot of space to take risks. And of course, while ministers can often be a source of huge transformation, politics can also drive speed and short-term announcements rather than a long-term programme. And I think I can say what maybe some of the civil servants will always be too polite to say, is that the constant churn of ministers we saw over the last government actually there was so much stop-start, people stopped believing that things would follow through. And I think sometimes the attempts to create order over a system that is sprawling has ended up in kind of blunt controls that can actually add more layers, even though they're trying to help. And I think as someone new, I've actually been really surprised by how much brokenness people just operate in on a day-to-day basis. Sticking plasters on top of sticking plasters, agency staff to fill gaps, and some really fundamental issues that haven't been addressed or have been left for a rainy day, too difficult right now. And I think within this, there's been a kind of grinding down of confidence and autonomy. And too often really great people actually don't believe things can change. They kind of start with some of the barriers rather than the possibilities, because they've operated in a system that has knocked some of that confidence and hope out of them. And I think we're missing the energy that comes with really opening up new resources, ideas, solutions that weren't immediately obvious. And now when I really need energy, I go out into the community and see the amazing work that's happening, but that isn't something that routinely happens. But I think the civil service is absolutely full of people who want to work differently, who can see the problems in front of them. And if they're asked to help solve them rather than finding very ingenious ways to work around them, which they do, I think we could unlock huge change at pace. One anecdote that always stays with me is talking to Fiona, who's our brilliant head of people, and they were doing a piece of work to try and kind of test and learn new approaches to recruitment to speed it up. And they went out to departments to ask for good practice. And at first, nobody wanted to send them in because they were scared that they would be stopped doing their innovation. And I think that says a lot about where the culture is. So I think we need to create a culture that rewards innovation, that supports people who are taking risks and accepts that sometimes things won't go well, and enables and scales really great work. To give civil servants agency and confidence, to do things differently and link them into the best of what's happening in communities. And we're very serious about long-term change and rewiring the state so that the public always comes first. And we are trying to drive some foundational changes to unlock this through our plans for a more productive and agile state. And we definitely need the right skills and capacity for a digital age. The conversation we just had focused on that. And I don't know if everyone's read the State of Digital report, but it is really sobering reading. 9% of major tech programs are assessed as green. 70% of people who were surveyed said that their data landscape is not well coordinated, interoperable, and does not provide a unified source of truth. And 28% of the systems that people are using are outdated legacy systems. So there's a massive need for change just to make this work better. And I think the new Digital Centre for Government is a massive opportunity, and they're systematically working very closely with us in the Cabinet Office, trying to work through these issues to ensure that we are set up to be a modern government. And we're challenging ourselves to be more productive, to save time and money by simplifying how we do things, from procurement, my favourite subject, to using AI to help us around discovering fraud. And in an ongoing cost of living crisis, when we want to invest more in the front line, we have a duty to be rigorous in our focus on productivity, which is why we started the SR with a zero-based process to make sure we weren't just layering new priorities on top of old programmes. We're reviewing arm's-length bodies to ensure that there isn't duplication, and we're really trying to look at every single avenue to ensure that things are as effective and productive as possible. But more broadly, I think we're determined to work differently to seize the scale of the opportunities of mission-driven government. And for me, I think there are 3 big shifts that are critical to achieving this. The first big shift we need to do is to break down silos and put people first. I think the operating model of our state has too often been central government at the top, local regional government, services, and then people down at the bottom. And we put people through processes that are designed at the centre and don't really see them as people. So they get 10 minutes at a job centre or 10 minutes in a homelessness assessment, and they end up bouncing around the system, don't meeting different thresholds for support, spending years on waiting lists and waiting to be in so much crisis that someone is there to help. And I think if we continue to work in silos and see our little bit of the problem, then we're going to continue to create that fragmentation and confusion on the ground. And if you start with people, how they live, their aspirations, who's important to them, you would never design the public services that we have, which have ended up, despite all the brilliant work going on, too siloed, too focused on crisis, mismatched boundaries, and too often actually detached from the strengths of communities. So our job is to change things, to put people first, and people should be able to access public services in a way and at a time that suits them. There should be no wrong door when you need help. Public services are able to respond together. And they should have a solution that makes sense for their community, designed with and for them. And the mission structures are the first step to changing this, cross-departmental boards with shared governance over long-term challenges, and they're driving new ways of working. But we're building on this by asking government to come together in new ways, to pool funding, to integrate data, to set shared outcomes, to routinely work cross-government with shared purpose and shared accountability. And this is critical for delivering our missions, for reforming public services, but also for saving money, because investing together on a range of outcomes cuts out duplication and waste and creates opportunities to use the scale of government, whether that's to buy once and well, or to share some of the back office functions. The second big shift I think we need to see is to bring policymakers and delivery much closer together, working flexibly and at pace. In my 14 years in Camden, where we are today, Whitehall was literally down the road, but it often felt very far away. And too often, the work we were doing to create public services that supported people, that valued the relationships that mattered to them, often felt that we were doing that in spite of government. And it was lots of different decisions, multiple grants, all with their own detailed reporting, lots of rules and checks, and a lack of coherence from different parts of government. Things that need national approval, and a one-size-fits-all approach for councils that led to that. And I am a massive proponent of devolution and localism, with decisions made closer to communities. But I think a strong devolved system goes hand in hand with a stronger and smarter centre, which is setting a national direction and national standards, able to make sense of data, able to step in when there's failure, or to step in and find great practice. But I think the layer that is hardest and arguably most ignored is the messy middle in between, because many challenges that we face require a joined-up approach between the centre and local places. Sustained partnership, teams working together across different levels of government, and I think we've been particularly poor at this. And I remember in the COVID crisis, when test and trace was being developed, and those of us in local government were saying, look, we have people on the ground who know their communities, we can do this. But a national system was developed that cost billions, and kind of when that had, that issues had happened with that, then we came back to local places and said, actually, can you help? Whereas imagine if we'd started to build that together from the beginning, how much money would have been saved, and how much faster we would have got better outcomes. So I think there needs to be that new approach, shared teams taking on challenges together, and a constant feedback loop from what is happening on the ground through into the centre. And I think key to changing this is how the civil service does policy. I think policymakers need the opportunity to be out in communities, working with job centre staff, social workers, residents, building from their experience. When there were issues with UC, universal credit, it was working in that way with a job centre in Sutton that started to reform that programme. Because those on the ground know what isn't working. They can tell you how people fall through the cracks. They know the problems. And my boss, Pat McFadden, made a speech where he set out this commitment to a new approach where we don't just make decisions in Whitehall, but innovate together with the front line, backed by a 100 million investment fund. But our test, learn and grow approach isn't just about a new fund, it's about a new way of working that starts small, tests ideas, constantly learns and tweaks as you scale, rather than needing to design everything up front, which I don't think worked ever actually, but certainly doesn't work when the technology is moving at such pace. And we will invest in developing our people so that they have the skills and knowledge to work in this way, more people who are designers, who can rapidly prototype ideas with communities. And I know that there are real barriers to doing this, otherwise it would have scaled already. And that's why the test and learn approach is not just about testing new approaches on the ground, it's actually testing new approaches at the centre where we find rules that are holding us back, changing those rules. And then the final shift is that the civil service needs to become a more outward-looking organisation. Partnership with local and regional government, civil society, communities has to become the default way of working. All of our missions require deep and long-lasting partnerships. So, for example, if we are going to make real progress on health inequality, we have to work differently. I remember when I was leading Camden, we did a citizens' assembly with residents on what was the biggest health inequality issue. And I was expecting something like GP access or maybe obesity to come out. But actually the number one thing that residents says was it was social isolation. So if you're designing a system around social isolation, you have to work with communities, faith groups, high streets, and bring them into making change. And at the same time, we need to drive government delivery, but we need to help and mobilise these new partnerships. And I think the magic happens when we pull all this together and we find common purpose and new connections. So we want to see new problem-solving partnerships, drawing on innovation on the ground. So government can help catalyse change and provide a framework to grow social innovation. But we have to be open and think differently about the levers that we have. So the public sector has enormous buying power, 400 billion a year. And rather than just buying goods and services, we want to use this to support jobs, skills, opportunities, and grow industry and innovation. Equally, the public sector owns a huge amount of land around the country. And rather than look at that in isolation around the needs of one department or one or a council or one service, actually how we can use those assets to collectively transform places, unlock land for house building and support the missions. So we're determined to be a more open and a more porous organisation with talent coming into the civil service from all different sectors with a flow of new ideas and perspectives. And this also means the civil service being a truly national organisation. We recently announced plans to grow the civil service presence in 13 locations around the country. And we want you to be able to start your career in the civil service and get to the top of the civil service in places around the UK. So starting with a school leaver apprenticeship and plans to ensure that 50% of senior civil servant roles are outside of London. And we don't want those just to be offices that are in places. We want those to be places where civil servants are working with people on the ground to test out new ideas. And places that we draw in new talent. And I think there's massive opportunities for places for growth to support social mobility. The opportunity mission is about unleashing the talent in the country, and we need to make sure that's real in the civil service. So the task ahead is to rewire the state from the ground up. And standing here today, that might feel really enormous, but I know the energy and optimism that comes from working with communities is deeply infectious. And across the country, I meet people all the time in Grimsby and the Wirral around the country who are finding new ways to improve things, powered by absolute love and pride in their places and communities. And too often they felt that they've been doing that at the margins or the edges or having to battle the status quo. But I think if we invite them in and ask them to help us to change things from the inside out, I have absolutely no doubt that we will see huge transformation quickly. And things that standing here today feel really impossible will quite quickly become very possible. So we'll be starting with Darlington, Sheffield and Leeds with community mission challenges. These are new teams bringing together civil servants, council officers, frontline workers and communities to work together to test new approaches to take forward the growth, opportunity and health mission. And we'll also be developing a new secondment programme launched between local and central government to share experience and skills. We want to develop this approach locally and then scale it. So we're getting behind people, creating change that they can really see and feel in their cities, in their towns, and their villages. And I hope that those teams and the teams that we will grow around the country and in London will feel like some of the most exciting and dynamic places to work in the civil service, really on the front line of mission delivery. Because our missions are not just missions for government, they're missions for the country. They belong to everyone, and there's very much an open invitation to everyone in this room, civil servants, non-civil servants, to be part of making this happen on the ground. And I'm really, truly excited to see what communities will create when we give them the power to lead lasting change.
Thank you so much. Huge amount in that, and I think really exciting and brilliantly picking up so many of the themes actually that we've been discussing today. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, so I'm going to just ask a couple myself, so I'll be restrained, so that then I can open it up to the floor, as I'm sure lots of people will have questions. I think it's really brilliant to hear you talking about empowering both people within central government in their roles and then also in public services themselves, in local communities. It's also a profound cultural shift in the way that things have been done. You talked yourself about how central government has been historically quite insular, a bit defensive. But part of that is also because, and again you mentioned this, that it involves a huge amount of risk in letting go, in ministers trusting people to get on with it. That's going to require different accountability systems. I guess coming back to the point that you made at the start of someone saying to you, but isn't this what Mo Molan talked about a while ago? Sort of, how does it look different? You know, what is going to change so that those people in those different place-based communities in different parts of central government are thinking, I am going to take that risk. I am going to come up with that idea. I'm going to behave differently.
Yeah, I think that the change kind of needs to be at every level. So the mission structures at the top through to, you know, what I was talking about, which is change from the ground up. And I think when I was in local government, I used to, you know, you can come and speak here and say, oh, there's so much energy and it's amazing. But actually, I think there's something powerful about just doing the change that you want to do. So actually just getting out and doing things differently, not writing a whole paper about it, but actually starting in these 3 places. Let's give people real permission. You know, we're saying publicly, we want to do things differently. This is about taking risks. We're going to put in development for those individuals. We're going to create joint teams. And you are there to test new approaches and see what happens and kind of, you know, be there to support that program. And if that goes well, you know, others will go and see it, and then we grow it to more places. So I think there is a real energy from starting and from making connections. And you know, when we were doing missions in Camden, the kind of power would come at a mission summit when you had somebody from, you know, director at London Zoo and a tenant rep and somebody from the council, and they were all starting to talk together, and you start to see, you know, possibilities and opportunities that weren't there before. So I really believe if we start that work from the ground up, you will start to see real energy come from doing things. At the same time, we need to make sure we're creating that political space and that joined up approach from the centre. And I think, you know, as the power is when those 2 things start to really join up.
And it feels like and this is, I imagine, you know, a large driver of why the government is being really quite ambitious on devolution, because it feels like that's a lot easier to do when you're doing it in a local area. It's a place-based model where accountability systems are embedded within that local area itself. I guess for civil servants in central government, you know, there is still the sort of parliamentary scrutiny model for ministers. So in letting go, what does that mean for then being called in front of PAC when something hasn't worked out? Or how is that going to look different for ministers where the accountability is still very much sitting in central government? And how is sort of having the back of those people taking the risks? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, I think 2 things on the, you know, as I said, I really do believe deeply in devolution, and I think at a place level you can really knit together the services around people. But I think if if you also need to have a way for some of the ideas and the ways of working to kind of feed back into the centre. So I think that connection loop is so important, and it is about a new partnership. But to the question of accountability, I think just being really, I think part of sometimes what we do around devolution is that we kind of aren't really very clear about these are the outcomes that we expect, and these are the freedoms that we're giving you to deliver those outcomes, and this is how we over time will hold you to account, and with some transparency about what happens if over time those outcomes aren't met. So I think there's something about the outcomes that we set for places and being really clear about that, and our own within the civil service, what are the things that we need to deliver and what is the accountability across government to do that, and there's different models of creating change, and I think we often hold on to one, which is we set a kind of process control across the system rather than saying to civil servants across the system, actually, we are going to ask you to deliver that, like say, more secondments across government, and we're going to hold you to account for that. And actually, we want you to be creative in how you do it and use your, the knowledge you have of the barriers. And it's a shift, and I think that's the kind of shift we need to make, both for the relationship between the local and centre, but also the relationship between the centre of government and the rest of a civil service.
Brilliant. So I promised I would only ask 2 questions, even though I really want to ask.
I went on too long.
No. You didn't at all. They were very succinct answers, and I'm going to restrain myself in asking a question about procurement in the hope that maybe someone in the audience will do, because you definitely
probably bring it up.
You definitely are in the right place. There's no one here that's going to think that's too geeky as a topic. So I'm going to open it up. I'm going to take 3 questions. We do only have about 10 minutes, so if I can ask you just to give your name and organisation and your question rather than any greater life story that goes with it, then we can get through as many as possible. So, Michelle, yours went up very, very quickly, and then there's a gentleman behind, so I'll take those 2 first.
Hi, I'm Michelle Clement. I am... Is this on? Yeah. I'm a lecturer at King's and also the author of The Art of Delivery, which is all about the delivery and how they did it back then. It's fascinating to hear your experience and energy, and inspirational to hear how you're galvanising the civil service. Question, what did you learn by the end of your time in Camden that you wish you'd known at the beginning?
Great question. And the gentleman just behind.
Thank you. Will O'Brien from PwC. Anything more you can say on the 3 trials being set up on place-based working, and then just ever so slight, and then another thing, whether there's anything you can say around the freedom being given around technology, particularly sort of AI within those systems.
Great. Should we take those 2 and then we'll go for others? So, what do you wish you had known at the start that you knew at the end? And presumably, are you applying that now?
Yes, I think that's such a great question. I think I need to think about it a bit more, but the thing that really immediately sprang to mind is that when I started leading Camden just over 7 years ago, I had this real determination to turn the council inside out and work differently with our communities. And on that journey, I think the mistake that we made at the beginning is we would get all these kind of experts in to kind of help us do this, and to work with the community, and that it just every time it didn't quite work. But when we actually built up the capacity of our own voluntary sector organisations, our own residents to be leaders, that was the thing that made the shift. So I think there's something about really making sure that we are bringing our own capacity. And I think the thing I really learned from working in Camden, and actually Camden taught me this, was that you can just the power of possibility and change, if you bring the right partners in, is extraordinary. So we would often like if we saw a problem, we wouldn't say, oh, that's not the council's problem, it's DWP's. We would be like, okay, this is a problem in our community. Who can we bring together to fix it? And we created quite massive foundational change, huge investment because of that way of working. And so I think I believed that. I had a hunch of that, but I saw it happen so many times that now I believe it so strongly, and I'm definitely trying to bring that belief to the role I have now. And then the question about the work we're doing with the free places. So we have had hubs, civil service hubs, for a long time. I deliberately didn't want to change the name, because I think that the work to move civil servants out of London that the last government did was really positive. But when I went to meet people within those hubs, quite often I'd kind of ask them, did they come from the local area? And a lot of them did, and wouldn't have got jobs in the civil service if they hadn't have been there. And then I'd ask them if they were working differently across government, and they'd say, not really. And so within these hubs, even though they were like 4 departments, they'd have their little section with signs up, and they weren't necessarily working together. And I'd ask them if they were working differently with the place. And they might talk about, we're going in to talk to some school kids about careers, but they weren't fundamentally testing new ideas with the place. So, for me, that's a massive missed opportunity to really, have people in those places, cross-government, testing new ideas. So what we want them to do, and we've been discussing this with, we've got the place leaders and the civil servants and the mission leads all on board, is to choose a challenge which kind of sits under one of the missions. So we're not going to define that from the centre, but it could, we've been doing a test and learn with Sheffield about access to family hubs, for example. It's a great programme, but actually not always the right people are using it or able to access it. So taking a challenge. You might be school readiness, might be working to support needs, and having a team that sits across the council, the community, and the civil service to really run together at delivering it, with learning and development, with support to be able to do that, and secondments in and out of local government. Because I think one of the things that people have said to me is, so, firstly, secondments are hard, but secondly, if you do one, you kind of get forgotten. No one says, that's this brilliant experience you've got from this council. They're like, where have you been for the last couple of years? So I think that having that as a really structured programme that we're developing with the LGA. So, that's the kind of model that we're starting. And it's linked to the Test, Learn and Grow programme that I talked a little bit about earlier, which is the backed by the Innovation Fund, which is working in a very deep way with a place to take on a public service challenge, and we'll be launching 10 of those in the summer. I've become a real civil servant because I talk in seasons, so we launched those this summer. But it's saying actually I never wanted that just to be a project. I wanted it to be a new approach, and so I think it's really important that through these through the Places for Growth, we're really kind of actually trying to embed this into how civil servants are working.
Brilliant, thank you.
And yes, on AI, I'm very hopeful that they'll be able to use new technology as part of that.
Great. Hand at the back, James, and then Paul, you were very quick up as well.
Thank you. James Johns from Workday. Here's your procurement question, Charlie.
Oh, thank you.
So our friends from Restate have written about the notion of everythingism, the belief that every proposal, policy or project is a means for promoting every national objective all at the same time. And I wondered, Minister, whether you could tell us whether you recognise an inherent risk in burdening too much in the way of social outcomes on top of procurement. Government is not always brilliant at buying the thing it needs when it's only looking for the thing it needs. And if you add too much sort of social outcome on top of that, I worry that you'll end up, prioritising, well-meaningly prioritising sort of social outcomes at the risk of the thing that the government needs to run correctly.
Thank you. And then Paul?
Paul Morrison from the Planning Inspectorate. So I'm completely 100% utterly sold on the kind of way of doing public service, but I also know why myself and my fellow civil servants might be nervous about it. And if you expose a vulnerability of a problem, you're worried that other people will then use it to generate kind of negative publicity. And I just wondered whether, from your experience in Camden and elsewhere, how do you kind of create that safety and the willingness to take risk and the cover to do the kind of things you're talking about?
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that is a really brilliant question. I've heard so much about your work and commitment to relational work. I think a few things. I think there's something about how you set it out from the start. So when we talked about launch, test, learn and grow, and Pat talked about it, it was very much, we don't have all the answers. We're going to try some things. We're going to rapidly test them. And actually, if they don't work, we're going to be really transparent about that and stop doing them. And so I think, actually being explicit from the beginning that this is the way we're working, so there's not that real fear of like, this is going to go wrong and, we're going to create a massive story. It's like, well, that's okay. We've set out, that's how it's going to be. But I also think there's something about you have to you know, that's the role of politicians and senior leaders, is to hold the space. And, you know, there were definitely times when I was leading Camden that I got like really strong criticism. We were doing some work about imagination in policy, and you can imagine one of our opposition was like, "Why are you spending money on all of this?" And I was like, well, actually, the systems we have are completely failing, so we're going to need some imagination to develop something that actually works for people. And so I think we just have to, you know, lean in and be really clear that we are doing this differently. This is why. This is the evidence base. You know, in Camden, we were the only council in the country to get outstanding adults and children's services. So, you know, absolutely confident that it works. I remember Treasury coming to see us, and they were like, oh, you know, coming to see how we were saving so much money. And then, you know, when they turned up, and it wasn't some kind of great spreadsheet, it was all this, like,
they were terrified.
Relational activism, and we have a big sign saying "to love is to act" that the parents put together. So I think, you know, that there is, you know, being actually really clear about the evaluation and the outcomes, that this is not, you know, drawing on the strength of communities and handing over power is not a soft, mushy thing to do. It's a really kind of strong and evidence-based intervention that we can get behind. So yeah. So, and change doesn't happen overnight. Like, people will take a risk and they'll see how the system reacts, and if it reacts how it always has, then they'll probably withdraw. But if it doesn't, they might take another one, and that's the change that we need to see. But I think politically there is such a strong commitment to this, and, you know, hopefully over time people will feel that they have much more space to operate in. And within that, the other thing I'd say is that, you know, we often, you know, I think people sometimes think, oh, the missions are over here, there's a team doing them, and, you know, actually, like, everyone has permission to work on the missions. They don't need to wait. They can just get on with it and start leading projects, and that kind of innovation is going to be really valued. So I think that's the shift that I hope people will start to see, but it needs to be held by all of us, and that's why, you know, your position and the position of other civil servants here is so critical to be part of that change. Procurement. Yes, I think there's social value. I think there's been two issues. One is that it can sometimes, there's about 40 different definitions, and it can be very confusing for those applying for contracts to really kind of navigate that system. But also on the other side, people put beautiful documents in about everything they're going to do, but it's rarely tracked and evidenced, and we're not totally clear if it's happening. So I do think that we need a simpler but a stronger system. And so if, you know, being very clear as government, you know, we want you to track interventions around jobs, skills, and opportunities. This is what is important to them. This is what we're going to actually properly monitor. These are the metrics that we're going to hold people, suppliers, to account to. And I think, you know, if you get government public sector contracts, those are the things that you should be delivering, rather than kind of a whole kind of range of a wide-ranging role, different metrics. So I think there is actually the Chancellor was talking about it this weekend. There is a real desire to make it stronger and simpler. And, you know, I think we need to work with suppliers and contracting authorities to deliver that.
Brilliant, thank you. Sadly, we have come to the end of our time with the Minister, but I think we will in 1 second just say thank you. But I do just want to reflect that I think even just the amount of energy and enthusiasm and passion that you're bringing, I think comes off so clearly to people and really will resonate with everyone in the room. It certainly really resonates with a lot of the work that we're doing at Restate and will continue to do, hopefully, to help think through some of these problems and reflect. I do just want to say experts are still important, even if we also want to connect into communities. So you want the think tanks, really, for sure. Absolutely. But the idea of getting into actually talking to the people who use the services, the people running the services, is just fantastic to hear, because that's where actually the knowledge and understanding of what's going wrong and what's working is. So we are going to say thank you. Joe is just going to step up in a second once we've said thank you to Georgia to do some closing remarks and then handing very briefly to Simon after that. But can we say a massive thank you to Minister Gould for joining us?
Thank you very much. I'm conscious I'm standing between you and lunch, which is a very dangerous position to be in. Or more accurately, I'm standing between you and Simon, who's going to tell you where the lunch is. But I just wanted to quickly wrap up. It's been a fantastic day, and there are three groups of people I want to thank. First of all, I want to thank our supporters, particularly BT and Salesforce, but plenty of others in the room. You guys help us put this on and kind of very graciously host it. We literally can't do it without you, and so it means a huge amount that you've worked with us on putting today together. Secondly, to our speakers, Minister Gould was just reflecting on it, but the civil service can feel like this kind of slightly kind of impenetrable machine from the outside. Is quite difficult to understand, can feel quite faceless sometimes. And I know certainly that from that feeling and that experience from my time as an official. And it's so important to us that we can put on events like this, that people can come and speak at and share their views and experience and engage, not just with other civil servants, but people in industry and other public services who they can work with. So it means a huge amount that they've made their time to come and do that as well. And thank you, finally, to my own team and to the team, particularly Sylvie McDonald, our Events and Partnerships Officer, who kind of organises all this and puts it on. And that's the three. So could you all please join me in a final thank you and round of applause.
Well, I will tell you our lunch is in a minute. It's pretty obvious it's upstairs. I'll tell you how to get there. I first met Minister Gould about 7 years ago. She just picked up the Camden gig, I think it was called at the time. And then 2 years later, I saw you at a Kratos event, if you remember. And I thought, wow, you really got your together, right? And actually, if anybody can, this is not being platitudinous at all. I really think you can. And it is about top-down, and it is about bottom-up. There's one thought I'd like to leave you with. In 1992, a guy called John Carville, advising Bill Clinton, said, "It's the economy, stupid." And that's been a very resonant phrase that's gone through politics for some time, in whatever sort of political flavour you need it to be in. For me, it's all about delivery. Stupid. Nobody's stupid in this room, clearly. But actually, it really is about collaboration, combination, different models, even different financial constructs as well. So look, with that, you're not going to preach anymore. I'm rather optimistic. I get out of bed every day hoping for a better day than the day before. It generally works. But take that energy with you. Go and enjoy lunch. Out the door there, turn right, up the steps. You'll see the big column. You've been there before, so you know where it is. And then round the column, and there are two lifts, I think probably the fastest lifts in the UK, or pretty close to. You'll be up on the 34th floor pretty quickly, where we've got some light refreshments. We might even have booze. I don't think we do actually at lunchtime, but certainly some sandwiches and milk. So thank you once again. Thank you for coming.